The auctioneer grabbed Eliza Hollowell by the wrist and dragged her up onto the platform like she was a sack of grain he'd grown tired of carrying. Not gently, not with any pretense of dignity. He just grabbed her and pulled, and when she stumbled on the icy steps, he didn't stop. Crowd watched. Nobody moved to help. A few of them laughed. Last item of the day, folks. The auctioneer called out, and he was grinning when he said it, that particular kind of grin that men wear when they think cruelty is entertainment. A woman, unmarried. No property, no family willing to claim her, and as you can see, he gestured at her body with a sweep of his arm, like a showman revealing a disappointing trick. She comes with certain considerable qualities. The laughter spread through the crowd like fire through dry grass. Eliza stood on that platform in the January cold of Black Ridge, Wyoming, and she did not cry. She had learned a long time ago that tears only gave people like this something to feel good about. She stared at a fixed point, somewhere above the crowd's heads, and she breathed, and she waited, because there was nothing else left to do. If you've ever stood in a room full of people and felt completely invisible, if you've ever been looked through instead of looked at, then you already know something about what Eliza felt on that platform. And if you haven't, count yourself lucky, because that kind of erasure doesn't heal clean. This is her story, and it starts with $1. Before we go any further, if stories about women who refuse to stay broken speak to you, I'd be grateful if you'd subscribe to this channel and follow along until the very end. Hit the like button and drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to Black Ridge. Town of Black Ridge had grown up fast and mean, the way frontier towns often did. It sat at the base of the Laramie Range, like something the mountains had coughed up and forgotten about, a collection of wood-framed buildings and frozen mud streets and people who had come west looking for something better and found mostly hardship instead, that had made some of them generous and some of them hard, and it was very easy to tell which kind you were dealing with by the way they looked at a woman standing alone on an auction platform in January. Most of the crowd that had gathered outside the sheriff's office that morning were the second kind. Eliza knew their faces. She had lived in Black Ridge for 3 years, had served half of them coffee at Hattie Boone's dining house on Front Street, had mended clothes for their wives and daughters, had smiled and kept her eyes down and tried, the way women in her position always tried, to make herself acceptable. Small, unobtrusive, easy to overlook. It had never worked. With a body like hers, invisibility wasn't available. She was a large woman, tall and broad-shouldered, with hips and a chest that filled whatever room she walked into, whether she wanted to or not. She had dark brown hair that she kept pinned back tightly because she'd learned that letting it loose drew comments, and gray eyes that had once been described by her mother as the color of a coming storm. She was 26 years old. She had survived things that would have broken people half again. Her size. None of that mattered to the crowd standing in the cold, watching Hector Bragg wave his arm at her like she was a mule at the county fair. Bragg was the auctioneer. He was also, technically, the deputy sheriff, which meant he carried a badge and a meanness that had the law behind it. He had small eyes set close together above a nose that had been broken twice, and he wore his authority the way some men wear a new coat, too stiff, too conscious of how it looked. He had never liked Eliza. She couldn't have told you exactly why, except that men like Bragg tended not to like women who were larger than they were comfortable with and quieter than they could read. Starting bid is $5, Bragg announced. Silence. He waited. The crowd watched. Someone in the back coughed into their fist. $5 for a woman of working age, able-bodied. He paused on that, let the word with a smirk underneath it, and experienced in household work. Do I have 5 more? Silence. Eliza's jaw tightened. She kept her eyes on the mountains. The Laramie Range was white and enormous and indifferent, and she had decided, sometime in the last hour, she would look at it instead of at any of the people who were looking at her. $3, then, Bragg said, and there was something almost cheerful in his voice. Now, the pleasure of a man who enjoys watching a price fall. $3. Anybody? Come on, folks, it's cold, and I got other things to do today. Still nothing. The woman standing nearest to the platform, a wide-faced woman in a brown coat named Vera Hutchins, whose husband ran the hardware store, leaned toward her neighbor and said something in a low voice. Her neighbor covered her mouth and laughed. Eliza heard the word burden clearly enough. She had good ears. That had always been her problem. $2, Bragg said. A man in the crowd, young, maybe 20, wearing a hat too big for his head, called out, "I'll give you a nickel for her, Bragg, but only if she can cook." That got a real laugh. Broad and easy and warm with shared cruelty, the way laughter sounds when everyone in the room is in on the same joke except the person the joke is about. Eliza's hands curled at her sides. Not into fists, she wasn't there yet. Just tight, holding on to themselves. She thought about the morning this had started, 6 days ago, when Deputy Bragg had come to the door of the room she rented above Hattie Boone's place and told her she was being detained. She had asked why. He had said she already knew why. She had said she didn't. He had grabbed her by the arm anyway and taken her to the jail on Meridian Street, and she had sat there in a cell that smelled of old tobacco and cold iron for 6 days while someone she couldn't see built a case against her, made of lies, and the silence of people who knew the truth and chose not to speak it. The charge was theft. Specifically, the theft of a silver pocket watch and $40 in cash from the home of a man named Calvin Greer, a cattle broker who owned more of Blackridge than anyone else in town, and who had, according to Eliza's understanding of events, gotten himself killed in his own back room 3 months ago under circumstances that the official record described as an accident. She had been there that night. That much was true. Everything else they were saying about her was not. $1, Bragg announced, and now he was openly smiling, playing to the crowd. $1, ladies and gentlemen. Surely someone in Blackridge has $1 they'd like to spend on. I have $1. The voice came from the edge of the crowd, near the gap between the feed store and the land office. It was a quiet voice. Not loud, not performing. The kind of voice that didn't need to be loud because it was already sure of itself. Crowd shifted. People turned. Someone said, "Who is that?" And someone else said, "I don't know him." Eliza turned too. The man was tall, taller than most of the men in the crowd, and leaner with the kind of lean that comes from actual work rather than from forgetting to eat. He wore a heavy canvas coat that had seen considerable weather, dark trousers tucked into worn boots, and a hat that had probably been decent quality once, several years ago. He had a jaw that looked like it had been cut with something sharp and dark eyes that were moving over the crowd the way a man looks at terrain he doesn't entirely trust. He was maybe 35, maybe older. It was hard to tell with men who lived outside. He was walking forward through the crowd, which parted for him the way crowds tend to part for people who move like they aren't planning to stop. Bragg watched him come. The cheerfulness left his face. "This ain't a game, mister. $1 bid means $1 committed." "I know what a bid means," the man said. He stopped at the base of the platform steps and looked up at Eliza, not at her body, not at her size, not with the assessment of a man calculating what use she might be. He just looked at her face. "You all right?" he asked. Just like that. Straight at her. Eliza blinked. Nobody had asked her that in 6 days. "No," she said, because she was too tired to lie. He nodded once, like that was the honest answer he'd expected. Then he reached into his coat pocket and came out with $1, an actual silver dollar, and he set it on the step at his feet with a sound that rang clean and quiet in the frozen air. "She's not something to be sold," he said. He wasn't saying it to Bragg. He was saying it to the crowd. Looking at them when he said it, slowly, the way you look at people when you want the words as a land. But if it takes $1 to get her off that platform and out of your hands, then here's your $1. The silence that followed was a different kind of silence than before. Not the comfortable silence of people enjoying a spectacle. The uncomfortable kind. The kind that happens when someone says a true thing out loud that everyone was pretending not to notice. Bragg recovered first. His jaw worked for a moment, and Eliza could see him calculating whether to push back, whether this man was someone he should know, whether the crowd would back him if he refused. He looked at the dollar on the step. He looked at the crowd. He looked at the man. "Sold," he said finally. The word tasted sour in his mouth. You could hear it. The man Eliza didn't know his name, yet came up the steps and offered her his arm. Not grabbing her. Offering. There was a difference, and after 6 days in a jail cell, she felt that difference in her chest like something cracking open. She looked at his arm for a moment. Then she took it. Crowd made no sound as they walked through it. People stepped aside. A few stared. Vera Hutchins pressed her lips together and looked away. The young man with the oversized hat had stopped smiling. It wasn't until they were clear of the crowd and moving down the far end of Front Street that Eliza's legs started shaking. Not from fear, or not only from fear, from the pure physical release of 6 days of holding herself rigid and refusing to fall apart in front of people who would have enjoyed it. The man slowed his pace without being asked. He didn't look at her legs shaking. He just slowed down. "Colton Vale," he said. "I have a ranch about 14 miles east of here, up past the Ridgeback Draw." "Eliza Hollowell," she said. Her voice was steadier than she felt. "I didn't steal anything." "I know." She looked at him sharply. "You don't know me." "No," he agreed. "But I know Hector Bragg, and I know the difference between a criminal and a person somebody wanted gone." He paused. "They're not the same thing. Usually easy to tell." She watched his face when he said it. He wasn't performing for her. He wasn't trying to impress her with his open-mindedness or his willingness to take her word for it. He just said it, matter-of-factly the way you say something that seems obvious to you. That was somehow more disarming than any grand gesture would have been. "What do you want from me?" she asked, because she had learned the hard way that nobody did something for nothing. Not in Blackridge. Not anywhere. He thought about it. Actually thought about it, which surprised her. "Help around the ranch would be useful," he said. "Winter's hard with one set of hands, but that's not why I bought you off that platform." He paused again, seemed to consider his words. "I had a sister. She was a large woman, too. People treated her the same way those people treated you just now. I watched it for years." His voice didn't change when he said it, but something around his eyes did. Something went slightly more still. "I couldn't do anything about that, but I could do something about this." Eliza didn't know what to say to that. She was not accustomed to honesty that didn't want anything from her, so she didn't say anything. She just walked, and he walked beside her, and behind them the crowd slowly dispersed back into the warm buildings of Blackridge, carrying their assumptions and their laughter and their comfortable certainties back to their ordinary lives. They did not know that they had just made a mistake, that the woman they had laughed at was not done with them, that the truth she carried, the truth about Calvin Greer and the night he died, and who had really been in that back room, was a thing that didn't go away just because you locked someone up and tried to sell them for $1. Stayed. It waited, and Eliza Vane Hollowell had gotten very, very good at waiting. They reached the edge of town, where Colton had left a wagon hitched to a dun-colored horse that stood with its head down against the cold. He helped her up onto the seat again, offering rather than grabbing, and then he climbed up beside her and gathered the reins. Eliza sat with her hands folded in her lap and watched Blackridge shrink behind them as the wagon moved east. Cold bit at her face, and her breath came out in clouds, and she had nothing with her but the dress she was wearing and the knowledge of what she knew. She thought about Mara Whitlock, who had been in that back room and seen everything and said nothing. She thought about Calvin Greer, who had put his hands where they had no business being and had died for it, and the way his death had been written down in the official ledger as an accident, as though what had actually happened that night was something too inconvenient for the record to contain. She thought about the silver pocket watch they said she'd stolen, which she had never touched, and wondered whose hands had put it somewhere it could be found, and pointed at her. Thought, Someone built this. Someone built it carefully. Someone wanted her gone badly enough to put this many moving parts together and aim them at her. Question was why? Because Eliza Hollowell was not, by any measure of her current circumstances, a powerful woman. She owned nothing. She had no family. She had no influence in Blackridge or anywhere else. She was a large woman, working a low-wage job in a frontier town, which made her exactly the kind of gun person that powerful people usually had no reason to notice, unless she had seen something she wasn't supposed to see, unless the accident in Calvin Greer's back room was more complicated than the official version, unless the story she had been carrying alone. For 3 months, the true story, the one Mara Whitlock was too afraid to corroborate, was the kind of story that could undo someone important. The wagon hit a rut in the frozen road and lurched. Eliza grabbed the seatboard with both hands and steadied herself. Colton controlled the horse with a slight adjustment of the reins. No drama, no comment. "You've got somewhere you need to be?" he asked after a while. "I need to get back into town," she said. "There's someone there who knows the truth about what happened. A woman named Mara Whitlock. She won't come forward on her own, she's scared. But if I can talk to her—" "Not today," Colton said. Eliza turned to look at him. "Bragg watches his transactions," he said. "He sold you legal, which means technically I have charge of you right now. If you go back into town today, he'll have a reason to pick you up again. You need a few days. Let him forget you're interesting." He paused. "Then you go back." She studied his profile, the jaw, the steady hands on the reins. The way he said "you go back" instead of "we go back," or "you can't go back," leaving the choice where it belonged. With her. "You've dealt with Bragg before," she said.
"Yes," he said.
Didn't elaborate. She decided not to push it. There would be time for other people's histories later. Now she was out of a jail cell and on a wagon heading away from Blackridge, and the mountains ahead were white and enormous, and the air smelled like pine and frozen earth. And for the first time in 6 days, could breathe through her nose without smelling iron and other people's fear. That would have to be enough for now. She did not look back at Blackridge. Looking back was a luxury she couldn't afford. What was behind her? The laughter, the platform, the dollar, on the frozen step that could live in her memory and be useful to her later. The anger of it, the indignity of it, the specific faces of the people who had found it funny. She would need all of it, not for revenge. She was clear on that, at least. Revenge was something you did when you wanted to feel better. What she wanted was something different. She wanted the truth to be on record. She wanted someone in an official position to say, in writing, with their name attached to it, that Eliza Vane Hollowell had not stolen anything and had not committed any crime. And the people who had built a case against her had done it with malice and forethought, and for reasons that the law needed to examine. She wanted, in other words, justice, which was harder to get and less satisfying than revenge and worth considerably more in the long run. Horse plodded steadily east. The sky overhead was the thin, pale blue of deep winter, the kind of blue that makes everything look slightly unreal, slightly too clear. A hawk turned slow circles above the draw ahead. "What's your ranch like?" she asked, because she needed to talk about something ordinary, or she was going to start thinking too hard about everything that could still go wrong, and that road led nowhere useful. Colton considered the question with the same seriousness he seemed to give everything. "Small," he said. 11 head of cattle right now. Some chickens. A good barn." He paused. "The house needs work." "What kind of work?" "The kind that comes from living alone and not caring much about the things you eat alone in," he said. Eliza almost smiled. It wasn't quite there, but it was closer than anything had been in a week. "Can cook," she said. "I wasn't asking, I know." She looked at the mountains. "I'm offering." He was quiet for a moment. "All right," he said. The wagon moved on. Behind them, Blackridge sat in its hollow at the base of the range, full of its certainties and its cruelties and its careful forgettings. Inside it, Mara Whitlock was somewhere in her small house on the south end of town, Eliza guessed, staying quiet, the way she had been staying quiet for 3 months, carrying a truth that was heavy enough to buckle her knees and not saying a word. And somewhere in that town, in a warm office, with the curtains drawn, the person who had built the against Eliza was looking at a dollar-shaped problem and wondering whether they had just made the situation better or considerably worse. They had made it worse. They just didn't know it yet. Eliza Vane Hollowell was out of the cell. She was alive and free and angry in the most useful, directed way a person can be angry. She had a place to sleep and, apparently, a rancher who didn't look at her like she was a mistake that had wandered into his line of sight, and she had not yet begun to fight. The ranch was exactly what he'd said it was. Small, functional, held together by the kind of maintenance that happens when a man knows enough to keep things from falling apart, but doesn't care enough to make them look good. The house sat at the end of a rutted track that cut through a stand of lodgepole pines, single story, built from rough-hewn timber that had weathered to the color of old bone. Porch roof sagged slightly on the left side. One of the shutters on the front window hung at an angle that suggested the top hinge had given up sometime last year. There was a barn in better shape than the house, which told Eliza something about the man who owned both of them. She climbed down from the wagon without waiting for help, because her legs had stiffened in the cold during the ride and she needed to move them before they stopped cooperating entirely. She stood in front of the house and looked at it and thought, I have slept in worse. She had. That was not a small thing to know about yourself. Colton unhitched the horse and led it toward the barn, and Eliza followed because she didn't know where else to go, and because the alternative was standing in front of that lopsided house, feeling sorry for herself, which she had decided sometime around day 3 in the jail cell was a thing she no longer had time for. The barn was warm, with animal smell, hay, and manure, and the particular dense heat that livestock generate just by existing in an enclosed space. There were 4 stalls, 3 of them, occupied the dun horse that had pulled the wagon, bay mare with a white sock on her left foreleg, a mule that looked at Eliza with the flat, calculating expression that mules always wore, like they were deciding whether you were worth the effort. What's his name? She asked, nodding at the mule. Doesn't have one. Colton was working the harness buckles with the ease of someone who'd done it 10,000 times. Everything should have a name. He knows what he is. Doesn't need me to tell him. Eliza looked at the mule. The mule looked back. I'm going to call him August, she said. Colton paused on the buckles for just a moment. That's a person's name. He has a person's attitude. Colton didn't say anything to that, but she thought she heard something that might have been a sound in hand chest. Not quite a laugh. Close enough. She helped horses without being asked because she had grown up around animals and because standing still when there was work to be done was something she'd never been able to manage. She found the brushes on a hook near the bay mare's stall and went to work, and the mare accepted this immediately, dropping her head and leaning into the strokes with the blissful selfishness of a well-treated animal. Her name? Eliza asked. Clara. And the dun? He came with the ranch. Answers to nothing. So 2 animals with no names. Clara has a name. Clara and August then. She kept brushing. And 11 cattle. 12, technically. Lost count of the calf born in November. Count. She looked over at him. He was hanging the harness on its peg with his back to her, and she couldn't see his face, but there was something slightly off in the set of his shoulders. Something like embarrassment, maybe. The kind that comes from admitting a small failure to someone who didn't ask. What happened to the calf? She said. Nothing. She's fine. I just didn't count right the first time. Eliza turned back to Clara and didn't say anything because sometimes the kindest response to a person's embarrassment is to just move on. They worked in silence for a while. The barn settled around them, creaking against the wind that had picked up outside. One of the cattle shifted in the back stall. August the mule let out a long, dissatisfied breath that seemed directed at nobody in particular. It was, Eliza realized, the most peaceful she had felt in weeks. Strange. She was standing in a cold barn with a man she had known for approximately 4 hours, with nothing to her name but a dress that needed washing and a head full of things she needed to do and couldn't yet. There was nothing peaceful about her situation in any objective sense. But the barn didn't care about any of that. The animals didn't care. The hay on the floor and the cold coming through the gaps in the siding and the smell of horses. None of it knew about Calvin Greer or Hector Bragg or the platform in Blackridge or the silver pocket watch that had appeared in her room as if by some dark miracle. It just was what it was. She needed to remember how to be in a place like that. She had forgotten. The house was cold when they went inside. Colton built a fire in the stone fireplace at the center of the main room, and Eliza looked around while he worked. The room was large for a small house, a table, 2 chairs, a shelf of canned goods and a few tools, a wood stove in the corner near what she assumed was the kitchen area. Dishes stacked without much order, a coat on a hook by the door with a pair of worn gloves stuffed in the pocket, single lantern on the table. No decoration, nothing on the walls, not even a calendar. It was the home of a person who had decided comfort was not worth the effort, or who had never been shown what comfort looked like. She found flour and salt pork and dried beans in the kitchen area, and she started something simple: beans and salt pork, nothing that required much from either of them, just something hot. She worked at the stove and Colton sat at the table, and she could feel him watching her, not in a way that made her uncomfortable, but in the way people watch when they're used to being alone and have forgotten that activity in a house can be observed rather than only performed. "You said you had a sister," she said, not looking at him, keeping her eyes on the pot. A pause. "Eleanor." "Where is she now?" Another pause. "Longer. She died 6 years ago. Fever." Eliza stirred the pot. "I'm sorry. It was fast." He said it, the way people say things they've said before, to themselves mostly, practicing the clean version. She was a good person. Better than most. "You? Quiet?" "No." Something almost warm moved through the single word. "She talked enough for the 2 of us. Could have powered a mill with the amount of talking Eleanor did." He stopped, seemed to hear himself. "I miss it, the noise." Eliza looked at him then. He was looking at the table, his hands folded on the wood in front of him, big hands with split knuckles that hadn't quite healed. A man who missed noise, who had named his barn animals nothing, and then listened without objection when she named them August. She was treated badly, Eliza said. For her size. Yes. By men? By everyone, he said it flatly. Men were the loudest about it. But women weren't much better. People who should have known better. He looked up. His eyes were level on her, and there was something in them that wasn't pity. She was certain of that. It was something older than pity. Something that had been sitting with its weight for a long time. I watched it and didn't do enough. That's the truth of it. I could tell myself I was young, or that I didn't know how. But the truth is I didn't do enough. Eliza held his gaze for a moment. Then she looked back at the stove. You did something today, she said. $1, he said. 14 years too late, and for the wrong woman. I'm not the wrong woman. I'm just not Eleanor. He didn't say anything to that. But something in the room shifted, very slightly, the way air shifts before weather. Ate without much conversation, the beans and salt pork plain but hot, and it was the best thing Eliza had tasted since before Bragg had come to her door 6 days ago. She ate more than she usually allowed herself in front of people, because she had starving, and because she had in smallness, for Colton Vale's benefit, was a thing she didn't have the energy for. He ate without comment, without looking at her portion, without any of the particular attention that people usually paid to how much a woman her size consumed. It was extraordinary how much it mattered, that lack of attention. After they ate, she washed the dishes in the basin, and he went outside to check the barn one more time before dark, and when he came back in, she was sitting at the table with her hands folded on the wood and the fire burning low and the lantern lit. There's a room at the back, he said, stomping snow from his boots at the door. Small, has a cot. That's fine. Blankets in the chest at the foot of it. All right. He moved to the fire and added 2 logs, then straightened and looked at her. You should sleep. You've been awake for... I'll sleep when I stop thinking, she said. He nodded. Like that made complete sense. Like he understood exactly what it meant to have a mind that wouldn't stop running its inventory of wrongs and plans and worst possibilities. The room at the back has a window, he said, faces east. If you can't sleep, the mountains are there. She looked at him for a moment. Is that what you do? When it's bad, he said simply. Then he moved toward the other side of the house, toward what must have been his own room, and paused at the doorway. Bragg doesn't come out this far, he said, not in January. Too much effort. You have time. How much time? Enough, he said. And that was all. She sat at the table a while longer, listening to the fire and the wind and the distant sound of one of the cattle shifting in the barn. August the mule was probably standing in his stall with that expression of bottomless skepticism, and something about that thought made her chest feel fractionally less tight. She thought about Mara Whitlock. Mara was 34 years old, a widow who had come to Blackridge 2 years ago from somewhere in Kansas and had taken a job cleaning rooms at the Ridgeback Hotel on Meridian Street. She was small and fair-haired and moved through town with the careful, practiced noiselessness of a woman who had been taught that visibility was dangerous. She and Eliza had not been friends, exactly, but they had been friendly, the kind of quiet mutual recognition that sometimes passes between women who are navigating similar invisible obstacles. Mara had been in Calvin Greer's back room the night he died. Eliza knew this because she had arrived at the house on a different errand. Greer had owed her 3 weeks of back wages for work she'd done at one of his properties, and she had come to collect, and she had heard voices through the window before she'd had a chance to knock. One of the voices had been Greer's, one had been Mara's, and then there had been a crash and a sound that was not quite a scream, and then silence. What Eliza had done next was what had ruined her. She had gone in, through the unlocked back door, into the kitchen, toward the sound of that silence. Calvin Greer had been on the floor. He had hit his head on the corner of the stone fireplace, and he was not going to get up again. And Mara Whitlock had been pressed against the far wall, with both hands over her mouth and eyes that were all iris. And the story of what had happened was written clearly enough in the overturned chair and the torn collar of Mara's dress. Eliza had not touched anything. She had looked at Mara and said, "We have to go." Mara had nodded, and they had gone, and in the confusion and the darkness they had separated, and by the time Eliza had gotten back to the room above Hattie Boone's place, her hands were shaking, and she had told herself, sitting on her cot in the dark, that the truth would come out on its own, that someone would investigate, that the overturned chair and the torn collar would tell the story she couldn't tell without putting both herself and Mara in the center of something very dangerous. She had been wrong. Of course she had been wrong. The truth did not come out on its own. Someone had come in after them and tidied the scene. Someone had written accident in the official record and made sure it stayed there. And then, 3 months later, that same someone had decided that Eliza Vane Hollowell knew too much and needed to be removed, and they had built a case out of a pocket watch and a few willing witnesses and the fundamental's assumption that a large, poor, unconnected woman in a frontier town would not be believed. They had been right about that last part. She had not been believed. She was still here. She went to the back room and found the cot and the blanket chest, and she lay down in her dress because she had nothing else to sleep in. And she looked at the east-facing window and the dark shapes of the mountains beyond it, and she told herself, Mara Whitlock is still in Blackridge. She hasn't left yet. People who are going to run have usually run by now, which meant Mara was staying because she thought staying was safer than leaving, which meant something else was keeping her there. Fear, maybe. Or something more specific than fear, the kind of specific that had a name and an address and could reach out and do real damage if Mara said the wrong thing to the wrong person. Someone was making sure Mara stayed quiet, and that someone was in Blackridge, in a warm office, watching Eliza's situation unfold from a comfortable distance. Question was who? Calvin Greer had been the kind of man who accumulated enemies the way some men accumulate land casually, as a byproduct of other ambitions. He had owed money to people and been owed money by people, and had spent the last decade of his life in a complicated web of debts and favors and coercions that nobody fully understood. When he died, that web had not dissolved. It had transferred. Somewhere in Blackridge, someone had inherited the part of Calvin Greer's interests that involved making sure certain things stayed buried. She needed to find out who that was before she went back for Mara. Because if she walked out into Blackridge without understanding the shape of what she was walking into, she was going to end up back on that platform or somewhere worse. Outside the window, the mountains were black against a sky, crowded with stars, and the wind had died down enough that she could hear the cattle in the barn and the particular silence that settles over a place when everyone who lives there has finally stopped moving for the night. Eliza did not sleep for a long time, but she lay still, which was almost as good. The next morning she was up before Colton, or thought she was, until she went to the kitchen and found the stove already lit and a pot of coffee sitting on it that was not good coffee. It was the kind of coffee that comes from grounds, used one too many times, and a pot that hadn't been properly cleaned, but it was hot, and she wrapped her hands around the cup and stood near the stove and thought. He came back from the barn about 20 minutes later, carrying a small pail of milk that he set on the counter without comment. "One of the cows is favoring her left front leg," he said. "Been watching it for a week. Not sure yet if it's the hoof or something higher. Can I look at her?" He turned. "You know cattle?" "I know animals. I grew up on my uncle's farm in Ohio until I was 14. She set down the cup. Lameness usually starts in the hoof. If she's loading weight onto the inside of the foot, it's probably a bruise or a crack. If she's standing with the whole foot out in front, it could be higher." He watched her for a moment with an expression she couldn't quite read. Not surprise, exactly. More like something that was in the process of recalibrating. "Come on then," he said. The cow's name, it turned out, was nothing. None of the cattle had names. Eliza crouched beside the animal in the cold stall and ran her hands down the leg, slowly, the way her uncle had shown her when she was 8 years old, and considered this the most important knowledge in the world, and the cow stood with the patience of a creature that had decided to tolerate being handled because the hands doing the handling were not rough about it. "Crack in the hoof wall," she said. "Left front quarter. She's been compensating for it, which is why the leg looks wrong. She's not loading it right." She straightened. "You'll need to trim it clean and pack it. I can show you how." Colton was watching her with his arms crossed and that recalibrating expression still on his face. "All right," he said. "You don't have a farrier close by? Nearest one is in Blackridge. Then we do it ourselves." He got the tools. She showed him the trim, talking through it the way her uncle had talked her through it, without condescension, just information moving from one person to another. Colton followed instructions with the particular focus of a man who understood that this was a skill he should have and was filing it away carefully. By the time they finished and the cow was standing straight again, the sun had moved well up in the sky and the temperature had climbed from brutal to merely unpleasant. They stood outside the stall and Eliza wiped her hands on a rag, and Colton looked at the cow with an expression that she thought might be relief. "You could have been a rancher," he said. "I've been a lot of things," she said. "None of them by choice." He looked at her. "What would you have chosen if you'd had the chance?" She thought about it. Really thought about it. Not the polite deflection she usually offered when people asked questions about her life that they didn't actually want to hear the answer to. "A farm," she said finally. "My own. Not working someone else's." She paused. "Animals and land, and nobody else deciding what I was worth." Colton nodded slowly, like that was the answer he'd expected, or maybe the answer he understood. "That's not an impossible thing," he said. "For me it is." "I wouldn't say that." She looked at him directly. "You don't know what they've done. The charge against me doesn't go away, just because we both know it's false. There's a record. It follows you. Records can be corrected. With what? I have no money, no lawyer, no witnesses willing to speak on my behalf. The only person who was there and knows the truth is afraid of whoever made sure it stayed buried. She heard the sharpness in her own voice and stopped herself, breathed. I'm sorry, I'm not angry at you. I know, he said. Be angry. It makes sense to be angry. He paused. I'm saying records can be corrected because I've seen it done. Not easily. But it's been done. She looked at him. Who are you? Exactly. What do you know about records being corrected? He was quiet for a moment. The kind of quiet that is considering how much to say. I was a deputy marshal, he said, before the ranch. For 6 years out of the Cheyenne office. Eliza stared at him. I left, he said, in a tone that closed that particular door. But I know how these things work. Warrant procedures. Chain of evidence. What makes an arrest legal, and what makes it the kind of thing a circuit judge throws out on principle? He met her eyes. Bragg's case against you is thin. I looked at the public record. When I came to town this week, I was in Blackridge on other business, not looking for an auction. But I saw the notice posted outside the sheriff's office, and I read it. He paused. Evidence chain on the pocket watch is broken. It was found in your room, but the reporting officer was Bragg himself, with no independent witness to the find. That alone is procedurally questionable. She was still staring. You read the public notice. I read it, he said. And then you bid $1. Yes, she was quiet for a moment. Cow shifted behind them, no longer favoring her front leg, standing evenly on all 4 feet, with the self-satisfaction of an animal whose discomfort has been addressed. You could have told me this in the wagon, she said. You didn't ask? You could have offered. He thought about that. You were still working out whether to trust me, he said. I didn't want to load you down with. I didn't want it to seem like I was buying your trust, along with your freedom. That's not, he stopped. Seemed frustrated with himself in a small private way. It's not a transaction. None of it. Eliza looked at him for a long time. His jaw was working slightly, the way a person's jaw works when they're saying something real and aren't sure they're saying it right. And that particular imperfection, that small, visible uncertainty in a man who otherwise gave away very little, was the thing that finally settled something in her chest. Not trust, not yet, but the beginning of the possibility of trust, which was more than she had been carrying 24 hours ago. Former deputy marshal, she said. Yes. Who knows how evidence chains work? Yes. And you left Cheyenne because of something that happened that I don't talk about, he said. Quiet, final. She accepted that. She had her own doors she kept closed. It seemed fair. All right, she said. Then here's what I know about the night. Calvin Greer died, and she told him. All of it. The back wages, the unlocked door, the sound through the window. Mara Whitlock pressed against the wall, the overturned chair, torn collar, what the body had looked like, and how the room had been arranged when they left it. She told it the way she'd been holding it for 3 months, straight and precise, nothing added, nothing softened. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was silent for a long moment. Mara Whitlock, he said, she's still in Blackridge, far as I know, and she witnessed the whole thing. Yes, but she's afraid to speak. He was working through it. Someone got to her. After the fact, after you, and she left that house. Someone found out she was there and made sure she understood what speaking would cost her. That's what I believe. Who in Blackridge has that kind of reach? He said, not asking her specifically, thinking aloud. Who has the connections to get to a witness, clean up a scene, plant evidence in someone's room, and get a deputy sheriff to run an auction on a trumped-up charge? That's not one person's work. It's an organization, or something close to it. Eliza had thought about this in the jail cell. 6 days of thinking about it. Greer had a partner, she said, in his cattle business, a man named Fielding Rowe. I don't know much about him. I only saw him twice, both times at a distance. Greer mentioned him once, in a way that made it clear Rowe was the one with the real money. Greer was the front. She paused. If Greer died owing Rowe something money, information's silence, then Rowe is the one who would want it buried, and Rowe would have the resources to bury it. Colton looked at the barn wall. His eyes were moving in a way she recognized from her uncle, who had been a methodical man, the look of someone sorting and ordering what they'd just heard. Fielding Rowe, he said. I've heard the name. He operates out of Blackridge, but he has interests all the way down to Laramie, and mostly some cattle. He paused. He has money in the sheriff's office. Eliza felt something cold move through her. He has money in the sheriff's office. Means he contributes to the sheriff's re-election fund, which in a town like Blackridge means the sheriff does what Rowe needs done. He looked at her, which means Bragg isn't operating on his own. He's operating on orders. The scale of it was settling on her shoulders, the way heavy things settle not all, at once but gradually, the full weight revealing itself slowly. She had thought, in her worst moments in the jail cell, that maybe this was personal, that maybe someone had simply looked at her and seen an easy target. A large woman with no connections, no money, and a reputation already slightly damaged by the circumstances of her life. But it wasn't personal. That was almost worse. It was just business. The business of making sure a dead man's secret stayed dead. And she was simply the person who had been unlucky enough to be in the wrong hallway at the wrong moment. We need Mara, Eliza said. Without her testimony, everything we know is just, it's a story. It's my word. And my word alone didn't do much for me in front of Hector Bragg. No, Colton agreed. We need Mara. He paused. But we need to know more about Rowe first. His reach, his specific connection to Bragg and the sheriff. What exactly he's protecting and why. He looked at her. I need to make a trip. There's a man in Laramie who knows Rowe's business dealings. He was marshal there for 12 years before he retired. He'll talk to me. When? 2 days. Maybe 3. Eliza nodded slowly. And I stay here. I'm not telling you to stay, he said carefully. I'm saying if you go back into Blackridge without more information, you're walking into the middle of it blind. Rowe doesn't know you have anything. He thinks you've been sold off and you're gone. You have a few days of him not knowing where to look before he starts looking. He paused. It's an advantage. It's worth something. She knew he was right. She also knew that knowing someone is right and being comfortable with what being right requires are two entirely different things. There's work here, he said. If you need to keep your hands busy. The roof on the south side of the barn needs attention, and there are fence sections that didn't make it through November that need replacing before another storm comes through. She looked at him. You're giving me fence to mend. I'm telling you what's here if you need it. He paused. You don't have to. You can sit in the house and think. I'll mend the fence, she said. He nodded. Tools are in the lean-to. She went and found the tools, and she spent the rest of that day working on the fence line, on the north edge of the property, where the posts had heaved in the frozen ground, and 3 sections of wire had gone slack and useless. It was hard, cold, physical work. The kind that doesn't ask you anything except whether your body will do what you're telling it to do, and her body, which had never been the problem, did exactly that. She worked until the light went gray, and her hands were raw inside the gloves she'd borrowed from the hook by the door, and her back ached in a good way that comes from work done, rather than the bad way that comes from tension held too long. She walked back to the house in the early dark, and Colton had something on the stove better than last night. Actually, proper beef stew from what must have been a portion of one of the canned goods on the shelf, and she sat down at the table and ate without speaking for a while. The north fence will hold now, she said finally. Good. He was eating across from her, not looking at his bowl particularly, his eyes somewhere in the middle distance, thinking. She had the sense he'd been thinking the whole time she was outside. Colton. She waited until he looked up. The man in Laramie, the retired marshal. Will he help? He'll talk, Colton said. Whether what he says is useful depends on how much he knows. He paused. His name is Aldous Kern. He investigated Rowe once, about 8 years ago. Couldn't make anything stick. But a man like Aldous doesn't stop watching just because he can't act. And you trust him. I trust that he hates Fielding Rowe more than I do, Colton said, which gives us the same direction to travel in, even if the reasons are different. Eliza turned her spoon in the stew and thought about Mara Whitlock, who was somewhere in Blackridge right now, in her careful, noiseless life, carrying the weight of what she'd seen and the fear of what speaking would cost her. She thought about the overturned chair and the torn collar and the way the truth could sit in a room and be refused entry to the official record for years, if the wrong people had decided it was inconvenient. She thought about the dollar on the frozen step, the clean sound of it. She was not a sentimental woman. She had not been given the conditions under which sentimentality survives. But she thought about that dollar, and she thought about a man who had a sister named Eleanor, and who had missed his chance to do enough. And she thought about August, the mule standing in his warm stall, with that expression of resigned intelligence, and something in her chest that had been very tight for a very long time was fractionally less tight than it had been. That was enough for now. It was going to have to be. Outside, the temperature dropped again as the night deepened, and the mountains stood where they always stood, white and enormous and patient, and inside the small house, at the end of the rutted track, Eliza Vane Hollowell sat by the fire and let herself think very carefully about the shape of what she was going to do. Not revenge. She was still clear on that. But something was coming. She could feel it the way you feel weather before it arrives, the particular change in pressure, the specific quality of the cold. Something was going to break open in Blackridge before this winter was done. She intended to be the one who broke it. Colton left for Laramie on the second morning before the sun had cleared the eastern ridge. Eliza heard him moving in the house while it was still dark, the particular quiet efficiency of a man who had learned to prepare for travel without waking anyone, which told her something about his years on the marshal's circuit that he hadn't said in words. She was already awake. She had been awake for an hour, lying on the cot in the back room, watching the sky through the east window go from black to the deep blue-gray that comes just before dawn starts, meaning anything. She got up and made the coffee before he could leave on yesterday's grounds, and she found dried cornmeal in the back of the shelf and made something approximating Johnny cakes on the stove. And when he came into the kitchen with his coat already on and his saddlebags over one arm, he stopped at the sight of the food the way a man stops when he expected one thing and found another. "You didn't have to do that," he said. "Eat before you go," she said. "It's a long ride, and the cold takes more out of you than you think." He set the saddlebags down and sat and ate, and she stood at the stove with her cup and watched the window lighten. Neither of them talked much. There was something between them now that was not quite friendship, and not quite partnership, and not quite anything. She had a word for a kind of mutual understanding that had come from 2 days of working beside each other and eating across from, and not lying about what either of them knew or felt. It was not comfortable exactly. It was honest, which was different. 2 days, he said, when he was done. Maybe 3 if Kern wants to talk at length. He's a man who processes things by saying them out loud. "I'll be here." He looked at her. "You'll be here or you'll be here." She met his eyes. "I'll be here. I told you I'd wait until we know more." "I meant it." He nodded slowly. "There's a rifle above the door. Loaded. You know how to handle one?" "Yes." "Good." He stood and picked up the saddlebags. "There's enough food for a week. The cattle need water, morning and evening. The trough on the south side freezes over by mid-morning, so break it early. Clara gets grain separately from the others. She's still nursing the new calf, and she needs more." He paused. "I'll manage August," she said. Something moved across his face that was very close to a smile. "Yes," he said. "I expect you will." He left, and she heard the barn door, and then the sound of hooves on the frozen track, and then nothing but the wind and the cattle and August making a sound in his stall that could have been commentary on the morning, or could have been nothing at all. She stood at the window and watched the direction he'd gone, until there was nothing to see, and then she turned back to the house and set about the work of the day, because standing at windows watching empty landscapes was a luxury that people who needed to think did not have. She thought while she worked. That was the system. Her hands and body did the barn and the water and the cattle, and her mind did the other thing, the sorting, the weighing, the slow building of a structure out of what she knew, and what she suspected, and what she still needed to find out. Fielding Row. She turned the name over while she broke the ice on the south trough with the handle of the axe. She had heard it twice before Colton said it once, from Hattie Boone, who had mentioned in passing that Rowe owned several of the commercial properties on Front Street, including the building. Hattie leased for her dining house, once from Calvin Greer himself 3 months before he died. She had been cleaning one of Greer's storage properties, a task he'd hired her for at half a day's rate, and she had overheard him on the other side of a thin wall, talking to someone she couldn't see. He'd said Rowe's name twice, both times in a voice that had something careful in it. The kind of careful that isn't respect, but looks like it. She had not paid much attention at the time. She'd had her own problems. The memory was there, filed away, in the back of her mind the way her uncle had taught her to file things. Because he had been a man who believed that everything you saw or heard was eventually going to be useful for something. And the trick was to hold it without knowing why, until the reason became clear. The reason was becoming clear. She went through the next day, with the work and the thinking in their separate channels, and at night she sat by the fire and tried to construct the specific shape of what had been built against her. Pocket watch. Who had put it in her room? And when Bragg's connection to Rowe, was Bragg a conscious participant, or was he simply a man who did what the sheriff told him and didn't ask about the reasoning? The witnesses who had testified to her character at whatever passed for a hearing in Blackridge, she hadn't been present for it, which was itself a procedural violation. That Colton had mentioned, with a particular controlled anger that told her it mattered. And Mara, always back to Mara. On the third day, Eliza was mending a section of fence on the east side of the property when she heard a horse on the track. Not Colton's horse, different rhythm, heavier animal, and the pace was cautious rather than purposeful. She set down the wire and moved back toward the barn, keeping the structure between herself and the track until she could see who it was. The man who came around the tree line was not anyone she recognized. He was riding a big gray horse and wearing a long coat that had once been expensive and a hat tilted against the wind. He was perhaps 50, with a heavy face, and the kind of stillness that comes from a man who has learned that moving slowly makes people nervous, and that nervous people are easier to manage. He stopped at the edge of the yard and looked at the house, and then at the barn, and then, finding her at Eliza. "Morning," he said. "Morning," she said. She kept her voice even. Her hands were loose at her sides, and the barn door was 6 feet behind her, and the rifle was above the front door of the house, which was not useful right now. "Looking for the man who owns this place," the writer said. "Colton Vale, he's not here. When will he be back?" "Don't know," she said, which was true enough. The man looked at her for a moment, not with the particular inspection that men like Bragg used the up and down that was meant to reduce, but with a more neutral assessment, the kind that is simply gathering information. His eyes were pale, gray or maybe green. Hard to tell at this distance. "You work for him?" the man said. "I'm staying here," she said. "Name?" She looked at him steadily. "I don't know yours." Pause. He seemed to find that reasonable rather than rude. "Darius Crow," he said. "I'm a recovery agent. Work out of Cheyenne." Eliza kept her face still. A recovery agent. The polite name for a bounty hunter. A man who worked with papers and legally issued warrants, and the fundamental understanding that the law would back him up if the paperwork was in order. "What's your business with Colton Vale?" she said. "My business is with a woman named Eliza Hollowell," he said, "believed to be in this area. I'm told Vale purchased her at a public auction in Blackridge 6 days ago. I have documents indicating that she's subject to a standing recovery order predating the Blackridge charge." He reached into his coat and came out with a folded paper, which he held out in the general direction of the space between them. "If you'd like to look at the paperwork." Eliza's heart was doing something unpleasant in her chest, kept it off her face. "What kind of recovery order?" "Theft and fraud out of a county in Kansas. 2 years old," he paused. "She goes by different names, this woman." Hollowell is one of them. The lie was so clean and complete that for a moment she almost doubted herself. Almost 2 years, Kansas. A name she'd never used. Crime she'd never committed in a place she hadn't been in 4 years. They had built a second floor on the structure. Bragg's case was the first one, thin enough that a circuit judge might throw it out. This one was the backup, the insurance. If the Blackridge charge collapsed, there was a Kansas warrant waiting to catch her. Fielding Rowe was not a man who worked with single lines of approach. "I'm not Eliza Hollowell," she said. Crow looked at her with those pale eyes. "No? No, my name is Ruth Chambers. I'm a cousin of Vale. Came to help with the winter work." She said it calmly, the way you say things that are true, the way you say things you've said before. She had not prepared this lie, but she had lived long enough to know that the best lies are simple and immediately verifiable only by people who aren't present. Crow was quiet for a moment. She could feel him assessing, not convinced, not dismissing. "Vale have any way to confirm that when he returns?" he said. "He knows who his cousins are," she said. "You're welcome to come back and ask him." Another pause. He folded the paper and put it back in his coat. "I may do that," he said. His voice was neutral. The professional neutrality of a man who has been lied to enough times that he doesn't react to it, just files it and moves on. If you see a woman matching this description, he reached into a different pocket and came out with a printed notice, which he held up just long enough for her to see her own face on it, rendered in the rough lines of a frontier printer's approximation. "I'd appreciate you letting the sheriff's office know." "Course," she said. He looked at her for one more beat. Then he turned the gray horse and rode back down the track, unhurried, and disappeared into the tree line. Eliza stood in the yard and waited until the sound of his horse was entirely gone. Then she went into the house and sat down at the table and let her hands shake for about 30 seconds, because they needed to and because there was no one to see them. Then she stopped, and she thought Crow would be back, possibly with the sheriff, or with Bragg, or with papers that were harder to argue against. He had not believed her. Completely, she could see that in the way he'd looked at her just before he turned the horse. A man who had been doing this work long enough had a sense for the space between a lie and a truth, even when he couldn't prove which was which. She had maybe a day, possibly 2. She needed Colton back. And if Colton wasn't back in time, she needed to be gone, which meant she needed to have already done what she needed to do in Blackridge, because running without accomplishing anything left her exactly where she'd started and considerably more exposed. She spent the rest of the day working with one eye on the track and her mind moving very fast through possibilities. And that evening, when the light was going orange over the mountains, she heard a horse on the track again, and this time she was out of the barn and across the yard before she'd fully decided to move. Colton. She knew the rhythm of his before she saw him, which surprised her. She had not known she'd been paying that close attention. He came into the yard and read her face immediately. "What happened?" "A recovery agent named Darius Crow came this morning. He has a warrant with my name on it out of Kansas. Forged. I've never been to Kansas in the past 4 years, but it looks official enough that it'll hold up long enough to get me in front of someone sympathetic to Rowe's interests." She said it quickly. No preamble. "He'll be back. I told him I was your cousin, Ruth Chambers." He didn't entirely believe it. Colton had not dismounted. He was looking at her from the horse with an expression that was focused and very level, taking it in. "Kern," he said, "he told me about a Kansas connection. Rowe has a lawyer in Abilene who specializes in generating paperwork. It's been his method before layer the charges until one of them gets traction." "What else did Kern tell you?" "Get inside," he said. "I'll put the horse up and then we talk." She went inside and started the fire, because the house had gone cold in the afternoon, and by the time Colton came in she had coffee going, and she was sitting at the table with a piece of paper she'd found in a drawer and a stick of charcoal she'd taken from near the fireplace. And she had been writing down everything she knew in 2 columns, what was documented and what was only known to her. He sat across from her and looked at the paper and then at her. "Aldous Kern," he said, spent 12 years watching Fielding Row operate and 8 months actively investigating him before the case collapsed. He knows the shape of it. Rowe runs his cattle operations legitimately, but uses them to front property acquisitions that are less clean. He buys land from people who owe him money, buys it cheap, or takes it in lieu of debt. He's been doing it for 20 years, and he's gotten very good at making pressure look like a fair transaction. He poured himself coffee and set his hands around the cup. Calvin Greer owed him $40,000. Eliza looked up from the paper. 1,000. Bad investment 3 years ago. Greer borrowed from Rowe to fund it, and it failed, and the debt kept growing. By the time Greer died, Rowe owned him. Colton paused. But Greer had something on Rowe. Something older, from before the debt. Kern doesn't know exactly what it was, but he knows it existed because he watched Rowe step carefully around Greer for years, even when the power had shifted completely in Rowe's direction. A man like Rowe doesn't step carefully unless he has a reason. Whatever Greer had, Eliza said slowly, died with him. Should have. Unless he kept a record of it somewhere, Colton said. They looked at each other. Greer's office, she said. He had an office above the Land Trust building on Meridian Street. I was never inside it. But I know he worked there. Rowe's people will have searched it after the death, Colton said. If there was anything obvious, they would have found it. Greer wasn't an obvious man, she said. She was thinking about the voice she'd heard through the thin wall, the careful way he'd said Rowe's name. A man who knew he was living under someone else's thumb and was managing that knowledge very precisely. He would have hidden it somewhere that looked like nothing. We can't get to his office, Colton said. Not without drawing exactly the attention we can't afford right now. No, she agreed, but we can get to Mara. She set the charcoal down. Colton, it's time. Crow coming here means Rowe knows I'm not gone. He's going to keep tightening. If we wait any longer, Mara disappears, or she gets moved somewhere I can't reach. Rowe doesn't leave witnesses indefinitely. He's patient, but he's patient because he's waiting for the right moment to clean up. The word clean up sat in the warm air of the small house, and neither of them needed to say what it meant in practical terms. We go tomorrow, Colton said. Before dawn. I know a way into Blackridge that doesn't come through the main street approach. We go to Mara first, before anything else. He paused. If she won't talk. She'll talk, Eliza said. She's been carrying this alone for 3 months. There's a point past which carrying something alone stops feeling safe and starts feeling like it's going to break you. She paused. I know that point. She's past it. Colton looked at her. Something in his expression was careful, in a way she'd noticed before, the particular carefulness of a man who is aware. He is seeing something real and doesn't want to respond to it clumsily. How are you? He said. Not are you all right with its expectation of a specific answer. Just, how are you? Eliza thought about it honestly. Afraid, she said, but the kind of afraid that makes you move rather than stop. Paused. I've been worse. Yes, he said. So have I. They planned until the fire burned low, and she noticed that he talked differently when he was planning, less careful with the words, more direct, professional instincts from his years, as a marshal running under the surface and occasionally breaking through in the specific way he talked about approach, routes, and contingency, and what would constitute enough evidence to force a circuit judge to look at the case seriously. She found herself thinking that this was probably who he had been before whatever had happened in Cheyenne that he didn't talk about. Capable man in full possession of his capabilities. The ranch and the unnamed animals in the house, with nothing on the walls, that was what happened after. She wondered about the before and then reminded herself that it wasn't hers to wonder about unless he offered it. She went to the back room and lay down without any real expectation of sleeping, and then slept almost immediately, which surprised her when she woke at the hour before dawn and felt the unexpected sensation of having actually rested. They left the ranch in the dark, both on horseback, taking the route Colton knew that came down from the ridge north of town and entered Blackridge through the old mill property that had been empty since the previous owner had died in debt 2 winters ago. The horses picked their way carefully in the dark, and neither of them spoke much, and the cold was a physical weight that pressed in from all sides and made breathing a small, deliberate effort. Black Ridge looked different in the early dark before the town woke up. It looked, Eliza thought, more like what it actually was, a fragile collection of wooden structures and frozen mud and human ambition stacked against the indifference of the mountains, held together by habit and the absence of better options. She had once found the town's smallness claustrophobic. Now she found it clarifying. In a small place, everything was close. Problems and the people who'd made them were never more than a few streets away. Mara Whitlock lived in a room at the back of the Ridgeback Hotel, a privilege of her employment as the hotel's cleaning woman. They left the horses at the mill and went the rest of the way on foot, moving through the alleys rather than the streets. And Eliza led because she knew the layout of this part of town better than Colton did. The back entrance to the Ridgeback was a plain door that opened onto an alley full of crates and old ash from the hotel's kitchen stove. Eliza waited, knocked again, quiet but insistent. A long silence, then footsteps, then Mara's voice very close to the door. "Who is it?" "Eliza Hollowell." The silence that followed this was of a completely different kind, sharp and immediate, and edged with the specific quality of fear, recognizing the thing it feared. "Go away," Mara said, low, almost a whisper. "Mara, I need 5 minutes. You need to go away. If they see me talking to you, they're not watching this door at 5 in the morning," Eliza said. 5 minutes. "That's all I'm asking." Another silence. Longer. Eliza could feel Colton standing 2 steps behind her and slightly to the side, making himself as unobtrusive as a tall man in a canvas coat can manage in an alley. The door opened. Mara Whitlock looked the way a person looks when they haven't been sleeping properly for 3 months. The fair hair was limp and pinned back in a way that suggested function over any other consideration, and there were marks under her eyes that good light would have shown as something close to bruising. She was wearing a work dress and a shawl, and she had her arms crossed over her chest in the posture of a person who is cold, and also trying to take up as little space as possible, which Eliza recognized as something she herself had done. For years before, she understood it was a learned response rather than a natural state. Mara looked at Eliza, and then at Colton, and then back at Eliza. "You're supposed to be gone," she said. "I know, they sold you," Bragg said. "I'm aware of what Bragg said." Eliza kept her voice quiet and even. "Can we come inside?" Mara stepped back from the door. The room was small: a cot, a chest, a single chair, a wash basin. The room of a person who had reduced their possessions to what they could carry quickly. Eliza noticed the small bundle at the foot of the cot that was either a bag being used as storage or a bag being kept ready, and she thought, she's been planning to run. She just hasn't done it yet. "Who is he?" Mara said, looking at Colton. "Colton Vale," Eliza said. "He's former law, deputy marshal out of Cheyenne. He's been investigating Fielding Row." Something moved through Mara's face at the name. Not surprise, recognition, and something underneath recognition that was closer to dread. "You know that name," Eliza said. "Everyone in this hotel knows that name," Mara said. "Owns the building." She sat on the edge of the cot and put her hands in her lap and looked at them. "He came to see me after what happened. A week after. He came to my room like this. Early morning, and he sat in that chair and he talked to me for a long time." Eliza sat on the floor with her back against the wall because there was nowhere else to sit. Colton stayed standing near the door. "What did he say?" Eliza asked. "He said he knew I'd been there. He said that Calvin Greer's death was a terrible accident and that it was important for everyone, for the hotel, for the town, for me especially, that it stay recorded as an accident." Mara's voice was very flat. Flatness of someone who has replayed a conversation enough times that the emotion has been worn off it, like paint off a well-used surface. He said if I kept quiet, I could keep my job and my room. He said if I talked to anyone about what I'd seen, he would make sure I ended up with the same kind of trouble that had found my husband before he died. She paused. My husband died in a county jail in Kansas, waiting for a trial that never came. The charges were fabricated. I've always known that, but I could never prove it. She looked up. Roe knows things, knows how to use them. The Kansas connection. Eliza looked at Colton. He was looking at Mara with an expression that was carefully neutral, but had something running under it, the specific controlled anger of a man who has heard this particular kind of story before, and understands exactly what it costs the person telling it. Mara, Eliza said, what did you see that night exactly? Tell me the whole thing. Mara looked at her for a long moment. Her chin moved very slightly. Then she said, Calvin Greer summoned me to his house. It wasn't unusual, he'd done it before. He'd been bothering me for months. Small things that could be explained away, and then less small things that couldn't. She paused. That night he made it clear what he wanted. I refused. He didn't accept that. Another pause. Longer. I pushed him. Came at me and I pushed him, and he fell backward and hit the corner of the fireplace. I didn't mean for him to fall like that. I was trying to get away from him. The room was very quiet. That's not murder, Colton said. His voice was steady. That's not even manslaughter under proper law. A woman defending herself against assault that's self-defense. A circuit judge would see it in 5 minutes. A circuit judge who isn't in Roe's pocket, Mara said. She said it without bitterness, just as a factual modification. There's a circuit judge out of Cheyenne named Harlan Pruitt, Colton said. He's been on the federal bench for 11 years, and he has a specific contempt for men who use local sheriff's offices as private instruments. Kern told me about him. He's not in Roe's pocket because he's not in anyone's pocket. He's in a position where pockets don't reach. He paused. If we can get your testimony in front of Pruitt. How? Mara said. I walk out of here with you and Roe knows in an hour. He has people watching. We know, Eliza said. We have a plan for that. She didn't. Entirely. But she needed Mara to believe they did, because Mara was on the edge of saying yes, and the edge was a delicate place. What I need from you right now is not for you to walk out the door. What I need is for you to tell me something. She leaned forward slightly. That night, after we left, someone came into that house and cleaned it, rearranged things, made it look like an accident instead of what it was. Do you know who that was? Mara was quiet for a moment. I saw someone, she said, when I was leaving. Through the back gate. A man was going in as I was going out. I only saw him for a second in the dark, but I'd seen him before. He works for Roe, manages the cattle at one of his properties on the South Range. His name is Fowler. I don't know his first name. Everyone calls him Fowler. Fowler, Colton said. Something in his voice sharpened. You know him? Eliza said. Kern mentioned a man named Fowler. He was a witness in the original investigation 8 years ago. Gave testimony that helped collapse the case against Roe. He looked at Mara. If Fowler was in that house after you left, he was there on Roe's instructions. Which means Roe knew what had happened within the hour. Which means someone at that house was watching and sent word. Greer's housekeeper, Mara said quietly, an older woman. She was always there. I never trusted her. Eliza felt the structure of it shifting and settling into something more complete. Roe had had a line into Greer's household. When Greer died, word went to Roe within the hour. Fowler went in to manage the scene. Roe then had 3 months to decide what to do about the 2 women who'd been there. Mara he controlled with fear and leverage. Eliza, who had no leverage, no debt to Roe, no history with him, that he could use Eliza, he had decided to simply remove, fabricate a charge, and let the town's existing contempt for her do the rest. It was, she thought, almost elegant. If you were the kind of person who could think about someone's life as an exercise in elegance. There's something else, Mara said. She was looking at the floor again. Her voice had gone slightly different, not flat anymore. Careful. Calvin Greer showed me something once. I think he wanted me to understand that he wasn't entirely without power, even with Roe controlling him. He showed me a letter, handwritten. He said it was Roe's, that it documented something Roe had done in Colorado years ago. Land fraud. Someone had died because of it. Not an accident, a deliberate death, made to look like something else. Eliza and Colton looked at each other. "Where is the letter?" Eliza said. "He kept it somewhere in his office," he said. "Told me, if anything happened to him, the letter was in a place that would be found eventually." Mara paused. "I think he meant it as a dead man's protection. A way of making sure Roe didn't decide his debt was easier to cancel than to collect. Didn't protect him," Eliza said carefully. "No," Mara said, "because I don't think Roe killed him. I think Greer's death was what I've said. It was an accident. A stupid, violent accident that Roe then used to his advantage." She looked up. "That's the difference. Roe didn't plan for Greer to die. But when he did, Roe acted immediately. And the letter, if Roe found it, when he searched the office, then it's gone. And if he didn't find it, it's still there. In Greer's office, on Meridian Street." Eliza stood up. Her knees were stiff from the floor. "We need to get into that office," she said to Colton. "It'll be locked," Colton said. "It'll be locked," she agreed. "We need a reason to be in the land trust building that isn't suspicious." She thought for a moment. "The land trust has public records. Anyone can request access to property filings. If you go in as a former lawman looking at public records for a transaction, they have to let you in." She paused. "And while you're there, Greer's office is just upstairs." "It's not a subtle plan," Colton said. "No," she agreed. "But it doesn't need to be subtle. It needs to be legal." "There's a difference." He thought about it. She watched his face do that thing, where it went very still while the thinking moved underneath it. "Mara," he said, "are you willing to put your testimony in writing?" A written statement, signed, that Eliza witnessed to Mooch, that describes what you saw the night Greer died. Mara looked at him for a long time. Eliza could see the calculation running in the small woman's face, the fear on one side, and something else on the other, something that had been there for 3 months and hadn't been able to get out. The weight of the truth she'd been carrying was visible in the set of her shoulders, if you knew what you were looking at. And Eliza knew exactly what she was looking at. "If I sign something," Mara said, "and it doesn't work if they find it, and they come back to me, then you're no worse than you are right now," Eliza said quietly. "Mara, he already told you what happens if you stay quiet and stay useful and stay here. You've been here 3 months waiting for the other thing to happen. Going to happen, whether you sign or not. The only difference is whether you've done anything with the truth before it does." Mara's chin moved again. She pressed her lips together. "I'll sign," she said. Her voice was barely above a whisper, but it was steady. "Tell me what to write." Colton produced a folded piece of paper from his coat. He'd come prepared for this, she realized. He told her he'd been thinking about it longer than their planning session last night, and he talked Mara through the specific language, clean and factual, the way official statements are written. She had seen, when, what she had heard, the full account of Roe's visit to her room, what Fowler looked like. Eliza witnessed it, signing her name beneath Mara's on the document. Then Colton's signed as a witnessing party and noted his credentials, former deputy marshal, Cheyenne District Office. It was 3 sheets of paper. It was Mara's handwriting and 3 signatures and a date. It was not nothing. It was, Eliza thought, holding the pages carefully by their edges, while Colton folded them back into his coat, the first thing that had gone right in 3 months. "Stay here," Eliza said to Mara. "Don't leave unless you have to. We'll come back for you." She paused. "I promise you, we'll come back." Mara looked at her with those sleepless eyes. "Why?" she said, not bitterly, genuinely. "You don't owe me anything. I was there and I didn't speak and they used you instead. You could take that paper and not come back." "I could," Eliza said. She stood in the small, cold room and looked at the woman who had been too frightened to speak and had watched Eliza get destroyed for it, felt the anger of it, clean and specific and directed, and then she felt the other thing underneath it, the thing that was not forgiveness exactly, but was an understanding of how fear works and what it does to people and how very few people are actually brave until someone shows them what bravery costs and what it gets you. "I could," she said again. "But that's not how I want to do this." She and Colton went back out through the alley door, back into the gray Blackridge morning. The cold so clean and sharp, it felt like it was cutting something loose in her chest. And behind them, Mara Whitlock sat on the edge of her cot with her hands in her lap. And for the first time in 3 months, she was not entirely alone with what she knew. The Land Trust building was 2 streets over on Meridian. They walked toward it without hurrying, 2 people with somewhere to be, and Eliza kept her head down and her eyes forward and felt the town around her like a physical pressure. The eyes she couldn't see, the attention she couldn't measure, the knowledge that somewhere in this small, careful web of streets and buildings, Fielding Row's network was present and watching, and they were running out of time to find what they needed before it noticed them. Colton pushed open the door to the Land Trust building, and Eliza followed him in, and the records clerk behind the counter looked up with the expression of a man who had not expected to be doing work this early in the morning. "Deputy records request," Colton said, and his voice had changed. Not louder, not harder, but different in a way that Eliza couldn't quite name. It had authority in it that hadn't been there before, or that had been there but suppressed. The old professional shape of it coming back like a shape coming out of water. He set a paper on the counter, his former marshal's identification, she realized. "I need to look at the property filings for the Greer estate holdings. Current status of the Meridian Street properties specifically." The clerk looked at the identification, and then at Colton, and then at Eliza, and then back at Colton. "The Greer estate is in probate," he said. "The filings are public record in probate," Colton said evenly. "That's the law. I can wait while you pull them, or I can look through them myself if you'd rather not leave the counter. Either way is fine with me." The clerk decided he'd rather not leave the counter. He directed them to a filing cabinet against the wall and went back to whatever he'd been doing. And Eliza, while Colton made a credible show of going through property filings, walked quietly up the stairs at the back of the room to the 2nd floor, where Calvin Greer's office door waited at the end of a short hallway, unlocked because the Blackridge Land Trust had not gotten around to dealing with the belongings of a dead man in the way that small towns sometimes don't for months. She went inside and closed the door quietly behind her and stood for a moment, letting her eyes adjust to the dimness, and then she started looking. Not for the obvious places, for the places that looked like nothing. Calvin Greer's office smelled like old paper and cold ash, and the particular staleness of a room that had been closed up for 3 months with no living person in it. The desk was large, oak, positioned to face the door the way men position desks when they want anyone who enters to feel immediately at a disadvantage. There were papers stacked on it, still there, undisturbed. Told her that whoever had searched this office after Greer's death had either been thorough enough to replace everything as they found it, or had not searched as carefully as they thought. She moved to the desk first, not because she expected to find anything in the obvious place, but because she needed to establish what the obvious places were before she could identify what wasn't obvious. The drawers held the expected contents of a land broker's working life contracts, correspondence, property surveys, ledgers with columns of figures that would take a practiced eye longer than she had to decode. She went through them quickly, not reading, just looking for anything that didn't belong to the categories of material surrounding it. Nothing. She moved to the shelves on the east wall, books on property law and frontier land statutes, a few volumes that looked personal rather than professional, a worn almanac, a farmer's guide from 10 years back, a Bible with a cracked spine that she opened and shook by the binding in case something was tucked inside. Nothing fell out. She stood in the middle of the room and looked at it the way her uncle had taught her to look at a field you were trying to understand, not at any one thing, but at the whole, looking for the thing that was slightly wrong, the thing that didn't sit right within its surroundings. Her uncle had called it reading the land. He had meant it for fields and fence lines and animal tracks. Principle was the same. The fireplace. It was on the north wall, stone-built, with a narrow mantel, and the remains of a fire that had burned down to nothing and never been cleared. The ash was cold. There was a single candlestick on the mantel and a tin box beside it that held matches. Kind of setup that was purely functional. Nothing decorative about it. But the hearthstone was slightly off-center. Not much. Maybe half an inch to the left of where the mortar seam suggested it should sit. Just enough that if you were looking for the thing that didn't quite fit, it registered. Crouched in front of it and pressed her hands flat against the stone and pushed to the right. And after a moment of resistance, it shifted grinding against the floor beneath it, with the sound of something that had been moved before and had been moved recently enough that the movement still came with some ease. Beneath, it was a shallow depression in the subfloor, and in the depression was a metal tin, the kind that tobacco comes in, sealed with its lid pressed tight against moisture and time. She opened it. Inside was a folded letter. 2 sheets, both sides covered in a dense, cramped hand that was nothing like a professional document. No formal heading, no date, nothing that would identify itself to a casual reader as anything more than personal correspondence. But she could read, and she read the first page standing there in Greer's cold office with one hand braced against the hearthstone, and by the halfway point, she understood exactly what she was holding. It was a confession. Not Rose's own hand, the handwriting wasn't Rose. She had no way to verify that yet, but the letter referred to him by name, and in specific terms, detailing a land transaction in Garnett County, Colorado, 7 years ago. A rancher named Samuel Oates had refused to sell land that Roe wanted for a rail expansion deal. 6 weeks after the final refusal, Oates had died. The official finding was drowning his body found in a creek on his own property, ruled accidental. The letters described in careful and damning detail how the drowning had been arranged, and by whom and at whose direction. The man who wrote this had been there. He had been paid. He named 2 others who had been paid, and he named Fielding Roe as the source of the instruction and the money. The man who wrote it was named in a final paragraph in a different ink, as though added later, as an afterthought or an insurance. This account is known to be true by Calvin W. Greer, who received partial payment of a land survey debt from F. Roe following Oates's death, and who has maintained silence on this matter in exchange for the business consideration that followed. This document represents his understanding that silence is not the same as ignorance, and that ignorance, once lost, cannot be recovered. Calvin Greer had made himself a witness, unwilling possibly. Trapped by his own complicity into a silence, he had then turned into a weapon and kept under his hearthstone for 7 years, waiting for the moment he needed it. The moment had come 3 months too late for Calvin Greer. It had come exactly on time for Eliza Hollowell. She folded the letter back into the tin and put the tin inside her dress against her skin, under the stays, where it pressed cold and hard against her ribs, and she replaced the hearthstone and stood up and straightened her dress and went back to the door. She listened for a moment. Nothing in the hallway. She went out, back down the stairs, to where Colton was still standing at the filing cabinet with a studied patience that she now recognized as a performance, and she came to stand beside him and said nothing. Just looked at him, and something in her face made him close the folder he was holding and nod once at the clerk. "That's all I needed," he said. "Appreciate the access." They were outside and moving down Meridian Street before she said anything. "I found it," she said low, "under the hearthstone. Everything." He didn't break stride. "How bad for Roe?" "Bad enough to hang him," she said. "If not for Greer's death, then for Samuel Oates in Colorado 7 years ago." A silence then. Oates Kern mentioned that name. Said it was the case before the one he investigated. Said he always believed it was Roe, but could never get close to proving it. "He can get close now," Eliza said. They were 3 blocks from the mill and the horses when she heard footsteps behind them. Not the casual footsteps of a town going about its early morning. These were deliberate, paced, the footsteps of someone matching their speed. "We have company," she said quietly. "I know," Colton said. He had heard it too, one person. Maybe 2. "Don't run. Running changes the nature of the situation in a way that's harder to manage." Kept walking. The footsteps kept pace. Then a voice. Hollowell. She stopped. Colton stopped. They turned. Darius Crowe was standing 15 feet behind them on the empty street, his long coat buttoned against the cold and his pale eyes level on her face. He was not holding a weapon. He had his hands at his sides. But behind him, at a distance that was not quite casual, was a second man younger, with a flat, patient expression and a badge on his coat. Not Bragg. Someone she didn't recognize. A deputy she hadn't seen before. "I thought that was you at Vale's ranch," Crowe said. Not accusatory, just confirming. Not a very convincing cousin. "No," she said. "I wasn't trying very hard." He almost smiled. "You're going to need to come with me, Miss Hollowell. I have a valid warrant." "The Kansas warrant is forged," Colton said. His voice had that authority in it again. "The one that had worked on the land trust clerk. The name on the originating complaint is a Samuel D. Breckett Abilene. Breckett is a clerk in the employ of an attorney named Yarwick, who has documented professional ties to Fielding Row of Black Ridge, Wyoming. A forged federal warrant is a felony under territorial statutes. Mr. Crowe, as I'm sure you know, and using one knowingly, makes the person who presented it liable under those same statutes." Crowe looked at him. Something moved behind the pale eyes, not fear, but recalibration. "I don't know anything about who filed the complaint," he said carefully. "I received a warrant through legal channels. If there's an issue with its origin, that's a matter for the courts." "It is," Colton said, "and we'll be happy to bring it to the courts. Specifically to Judge Harlan Pruitt in Cheyenne, who I believe you've appeared before, and who has a particular view of fraudulent recovery instruments." He paused. "Question is whether you want to be standing on the wrong side of that conversation when it happens." Crowe was quiet. The deputy behind him shifted his weight slightly. "We also have," Colton continued, "a signed and witnessed statement from a material witness to the death of Calvin Greer, which was recorded as an accident. And we have documentary evidence relating to the death of Samuel Oates in Garnett County, Colorado, 7 years ago." He let that sit for a moment. "The name Fielding Row appears in both documents in ways that will be of significant interest to a federal circuit court." The street was very quiet around them. Somewhere a horse moved in a stable. Smoke was beginning to come from chimneys as the town started its morning. In an hour, this street would have people on it, and this conversation would be visible and audible in a way that it currently was not. Crowe was a professional. She had understood that from the first moment in the ranch yard, and professionals, when they encountered a situation that had been substantially more complicated than the job description suggested, made calculations. They weighed the money they were being paid against the liability they were being asked to absorb. They asked themselves who was going to be left standing when the dust settled and whether they wanted to be beside that person. "I'm going to need to make contact with my client," Crowe said. His voice was careful now, neutral in a new way. "Your client is Fielding Row," Eliza said. She said it clearly, so there was no ambiguity. "And your client has been building fraudulent legal instruments against an innocent woman to cover a murder he ordered in Colorado. When this goes to Pruitt, and it is going to Pruitt, anyone whose name appears as an instrument of that cover will be examined, including recovery agents who presented forged warrants in good faith." She paused. "Or not in good faith. That's the part a court would want to establish." Crowe looked at her for a long moment. She held his gaze. Her heart was doing that unpleasant thing again, but her face was completely still, and she had the sense from the slight shift in Crowe's expression that the stillness of her face was registering as something he hadn't expected. "The deputy here has nothing to do with this," Crowe said. "He's local. He was told this was a routine recovery." "I know," Colton said. He looked at the deputy's son. "You were told a name and given a direction. Whatever you were told about the context, I'd verify that carefully before you put your name on anything related to this situation. That's genuine advice, not a threat." The young deputy looked at Crowe, then at Colton, then at his boots. He was, Eliza thought, about 22 years old, and had probably taken this job because it came with a badge and had not fully worked out what badges sometimes required of the people wearing them. "I'll wait over here," the deputy said, to nobody in particular, and moved to lean against the wall of the building beside him in a way that communicated his careful neutrality. Crow watched him go and then looked back at Eliza and Colton. Something in his face had resolved into a decision. "I need the rest of the day," he said, "before anything moves forward." "What do you plan to do with the day?" Colton said. "Make contact," Crow said. "Reassess the situation." He paused. "I was told this was a clean warrant on a thieving woman with no connections. That is clearly not what this is," he said it matter-of-factly, without embarrassment. "I'm not in the business of exposing myself to federal liability for a client who didn't give me the full picture. And if Roe tells you to proceed anyway," Eliza said. Crow looked at her with those pale, professional eyes. "I've been doing this work for 14 years, he said. "I'm still doing it because I know when a situation has changed, and I know when to put a warrant back in my coat and walk away." He paused. "This situation has changed." He turned and walked back up Meridian Street the way he'd come, unhurried, the way he did everything. The young deputy peeled off the wall and followed him at a distance. Eliza and Colton stood on the empty street and watched them go. "He'll tell Roe within the hour," Colton said. "I know, which means Roe will know we have documents." "I know that too. We have maybe 3 or 4 hours before he does something decisive." He looked at her. "We need to get to the telegraph office and send word to Pruitt's court before Roe can get to the telegraph operator." "And Mara," Eliza said. "We have to go back for Mara, simultaneously, which means we split up." He looked at her. "Can you get to the telegraph office alone?" "It's on Front Street, East End. The operator is a man named Hendricks. Tell him you're sending a message on behalf of former Deputy Marshal Colton Vale, and you need it marked urgent. He knows me. He'll send it." "What do I say in the message?" Colton reached into his coat and produced a folded piece of paper again. Prepared, she thought, organized in a way that spoke to years of doing field work where improvisation and preparation had to coexist. He unfolded it and read her the message, and she repeated it back to him until she had it exactly. "I'll go to Mara," he said. "I'll get her out of the hotel and to the mill where the horses are. You meet us there. If Roe moves before I'm done at the telegraph, then you get to the horses without the telegraph, and we ride for Laramie with what we have," he said. "The documents are enough to get Pruitt's attention even without the advance message. But the advance message makes it harder for Roe to intercept or discredit." She nodded. "All right." He looked at her for a moment. Eliza. She was already turning toward Front Street. Stopped. "Be careful," he said. It was simple and direct, and she could see that it cost him something to say it, that it was not a thing he said easily or often, and he was saying it because it was true, and he thought she should know it. "You, too," she said, and then she went. The walk to Front Street was 4 blocks. She walked them at the pace of someone with business to conduct, which she was, keeping her head level and her eyes forward and managing the particular challenge of moving through a town that might at any moment produce a face she didn't want to see. Hector Bragg could be anywhere. The sheriff whose name was Tolliver, and who she had seen exactly once at a distance, but who she understood to be the kind of man who ran his office by seeing which way the wind was blowing, could be anywhere. Past Hattie Boone's dining house, without looking at it. She had eaten at that counter every morning for 2 years. She had poured coffee for the men who had stood in the cold, and laughed while Bragg held her wrist and dragged her up onto a platform. She did not look at it. There would be time to feel all of that later. Right now she kept walking. The telegraph office was a narrow building wedged between the hardware store and a vacant lot. The sign above the door said Western Union in letters that had faded from black to a dull brown. She pushed the door open and went in. The man behind the counter was small and bespectacled and had the look of someone who spent a great deal of time in a small room processing other people's urgencies. He looked up when she came in and took in the sight of her with the neutral assessment of a man who had learned that people came into telegraph offices in all manner of states and conditions, and that this was simply the nature of the business. "Hendricks?" she said. "Yes, ma'am. I'm sending a message on behalf of former Deputy Marshal Colton Vale. He says you know him. He says to mark it urgent." Hendricks studied her for a moment. Then something in his expression settled. "Colton Vale," he said. "Yes, I know him." "All right. What's the message?" She recited it exactly as Colton had given it to her. Hendricks wrote it down in the efficient shorthand of his profession, and she watched him do it and checked it against what she was carrying in her memory. And it was right. "Recipient is Judge Harlan Pruitt, Federal Circuit Court." "Cheyenne," she said. "I know the judge's wire address," Hendricks said. He was already moving to his equipment. "This will take about 10 minutes to transmit. You want to wait for confirmation?" "I want to wait," she said. She stood at the counter and waited, and the machine behind Hendricks began its clicking sequence. And outside on Front Street, the town was becoming more fully itself as the morning advanced. More people on the street, more voices, more horses. She kept her back to the window. 7 minutes into the wait, the door to the telegraph office opened. She turned, and the man standing in the doorway was not someone she had seen before, but she knew what he was from the specific quality of his stillness, a man who had been sent to a location with a specific purpose and was assessing whether the purpose was achievable. He was perhaps 45, broad through the chest, wearing work clothes that were too clean for actual work. He looked at her, and then at Hendricks, and then at the telegraph equipment. "Who's the message for?" he said. "I don't discuss customers' messages," Hendricks said, without turning around or stopping what he was doing. He said it with the particular, mild authority of someone who has said this specific sentence many times before, and means it completely. "I'm asking the woman," the man said. Eliza looked at him. Her hands were steady. The tin was still pressed against her ribs under her dress. "I'm sending a message to my sister in Cheyenne," she said, telling her I'll be delayed in arriving. She'll be worried. The man looked at her for a long moment. She looked back. She did not look away. "Message sent," Hendricks said behind her. "Confirmation received." He turned and looked at the man in the doorway with the quiet confidence of someone who had been in this building through a great many things and understood that his office had a specific legal status. "Is there something I can do for you?" The man looked at Hendricks, looked at Eliza, made his calculation. "No," he said, and left. Eliza let out a slow breath through her nose. "Thank you," she said to Hendricks. "You're welcome," he said. He looked at her over his spectacles with an expression that suggested he was not entirely convinced by the Sister in Shan story, but had made his own decision about where his professional obligations lay. "You take care of yourself." She went out, and she moved fast now, not running, but close, down the alley beside the hardware store and through the back lots that ran parallel to Front Street, and then north toward the mill, because the man who had come into the telegraph office had not believed her story any more than Crow had believed the cousin story, and she had at most minutes before he reported back, and minutes after that before someone made a move. The mill property was a 10-minute walk at a fast pace. She did it in 7, her breath coming hard in the cold air, and she came through the gap in the old fence and into the mill yard to find Colton already there with both horses and Mara Whitlock standing between them, with her small bundle clutched to her chest and an expression on her face that was fear and determination fighting each other for control, and neither one winning cleanly. "Telegraph sent?" Colton said. "Sent and confirmed. Someone came in while I was waiting one of Roe's men. He knows we were at the telegraph office. He knows I was. He doesn't know what the message said." Hendricks didn't tell him. Colton was already checking the girth on Clara's saddle. "We need to move now. All 3 of us." He looked at Mara. "Can you ride?" "I can ride," Mara said. Her voice was thin, but her chin was up. They got Mara onto Clara and Eliza, onto Colton's Dun, the horse, without a name, and Colton took August, which he did without comment, and she thought she would have smiled at that under any other circumstances. They went east out of the mill property. through the back of the lot where the fence had rotted away, and then north along the creek bed where the willows were thick enough to provide cover and Blackridge fell away behind them. For perhaps 20 minutes they rode without incident, and Eliza was beginning to allow herself the first careful edge of something like relief when she heard hoofbeats behind them. Multiple horses, moving fast. "Don't look back," Colton said. "There's a draw about half a mile ahead where the creek bends north. If we can get to it before they close the distance, the walls give us cover." They pushed the horses harder. Mara rode with her bundle tied to the saddle horn and both hands on the reins, and Eliza thought, she can ride. She wasn't lying, and filed that away as useful. The draw came up faster than she expected, a narrow cut in the land, where the creek had spent years carving itself a path through the rock, the walls rising on both sides to maybe 15 feet, the willows overhead making a roof of bare winter branches. They went in single file, and Colton stopped them at the bend, where the cut widened slightly. "They'll follow us in," he said. "How many?" Eliza said. 3 horses from the sound. Maybe 4. He had the rifle out, the same one from above the ranch house door, she realized, which meant he'd brought it this morning, and she hadn't noticed. "I'm not shooting anyone, unless there's no other option. But I need to know what we're working with before they come around that bend." The hoofbeats slowed at the entrance to the draw. She could hear voices, could not make out the words. Then one voice, louder, carrying, Vale. "We know you're in there. Come out. And this goes easy." Colton looked at her. She looked at him. "That's brag," she said quietly. "Yes. Is he the kind of man who means it when he says it'll go easy?" "No," Colton said. "But he's the kind of man who needs things to be legal enough to survive a review, which means he's not going to shoot us in a creek draw if he can avoid it, because of Pruitt's court. He doesn't know about Pruitt yet, but he knows Crow told Rowe something complicated happened, and complicated means review." He shifted the rifle. "Bragg is acting on Rowe's orders, but he's still a deputy sheriff, and he still has to account for his actions to someone above him. Leverage." He raised his voice. "Bragg. I'm former Deputy Marshal Colton Vale. I have in my possession documentary evidence relating to a federal matter currently known to Judge Harlan Pruitt Court in Cheyenne. I also have a signed and witnessed statement from a material witness to the death of Calvin Greer. If you interfere with our movement, you will be obstructing a federal matter, which I will ensure Judge Pruitt is made aware of within the hour of our arrival in Laramie." Silence from the draw entrance. Then Bragg's voice again, and she could hear the uncertainty in it, the specific uncertainty of a man whose instructions had not prepared him for this particular sentence. "You don't have any federal case. You're a rancher. I'm a former deputy marshal, with current standing to present evidence to a federal circuit court," Colton said, "which your sheriff can verify with a wire to the Cheyenne marshal's office if he chooses. My credentials were never revoked. I left the service voluntarily." A pause. "Check it, Bragg. Before you do something that ends your career over a land broker's dirty business." Another silence. Longer this time. Eliza sat on the nameless dun horse in the cold creek draw and watched the bend of the entrance and breathed slowly and thought about the tin against her ribs and the 3 signatures on the paper in Colton's coat and the message that was already in Cheyenne on its way to Harlan Pruitt's clerk. She thought about Mara Whitlock on Clara's back, 3 feet to her left, sitting with her spine straight and her chin level, and her bundle tied to the saddle horn, a woman who had been silent for 3 months and had finally spoken, and what it cost a person to do that after so long. She thought about Hector Bragg on the other side of that bend, doing his own calculation. Kind of calculation that men like Bragg do when the instructions they received didn't account for the situation they're standing in. Question was always the same. How much risk was he personally willing to absorb on behalf of a man like Rowe? Bragg was not a good man, but he was a pragmatic one. She had understood that from the first moment she had seen him, with his close-set eyes, and his deputy's badge, and his auctioneer's grin. He did what was useful to him. Right now, the most useful thing was becoming a matter of calculation. We're going to ride out of this draw, Colton said, raising his voice again. We're going to continue to Laramie. If you follow us, you are obstructing a federal matter. If you let us go, you've done nothing more than your job, which was to inquire. That's a much easier position to defend to a circuit judge. He paused. Your choice, Bragg. The silence stretched until it was almost unbearable. Then the sound of horses shifting. Hooves on the frozen creek gravel, moving not forward but sideways. Pulling back from the entrance. Not gone, but back. Move, Colton said quietly. Now fast. They went through the draw at a canter and came out the other end into open country, east of Blackridge, the mountains ahead and the town behind, and Eliza did not look back. She heard Bragg's men regrouping at the draw entrance, but they did not follow, not immediately, not at a pace that was going to close the distance before Blackridge was behind them, far enough to matter. They rode hard for 40 minutes before Colton eased the pace, and when they finally slowed to a walk, all three horses were blowing in the cold air, and Mara looked slightly gray, but was sitting up straight and had not let go of the reins. You all right? Eliza said to her. I've been better, Mara said. Her voice was thin and precise. But I've also been worse. She paused. How far to Laramie? 7 hours at this pace, Colton said. We stop once to rest the horses. We don't stop longer than that. Mara nodded. She looked out at the open country ahead of them, the wide frozen plain running east toward the mountains. The sky above it, the pale winter blue that made everything look clean and slightly unreal. It was the look, Eliza thought, of a woman seeing space after a long time in a closed room. Actually work? Mara said. A circuit court. A judge who isn't in someone's pocket. She said it without cynicism exactly. More like genuine curiosity. Like a question she had stopped believing she'd ever need to ask. Sometimes, Eliza said honestly. Not always. But Pruitt has a history with cases like this. Colton's contact knows him. And the letter what you found in Greer's office, that's enough. The letter plus your statement, plus the forged Kansas warrant, plus the broken evidence chain on the pocket watch, Colton said. He was riding slightly ahead of them, his eyes moving over the landscape in that habitual way she'd come to recognize as an old professional reflex. Any one of those things alone is a beginning. Together they're a case. He paused. It's not certain. I'm not going to tell you it's certain. But it's a real case. And Pruitt is a real judge. And we have enough to force an inquiry even if the inquiry doesn't go the way we want. Mara was quiet for a while. Then Roe is going to know I'm gone within the hour. Yes, Colton said. He'll know I talked. Yes. Can she stop? Reframed the question. If I've already signed the statement, if it's already in your coat, can he still make it go away? Eliza looked at Colton. He was quiet for a moment, and she appreciated that he didn't answer immediately, that he gave it the weight it deserved. You can try, Colton said. He has money and connections, and he'll use both. But the statement exists now, and the letter exists, and the telegraph to Pruitt's court exists. And those things create a problem that can't be solved by making the three of us disappear. It would only make the problem larger. He paused. Roe is smart. A smart man in that position doesn't escalate, he tries to contain. And containment at this point means letting the inquiry happen and betting he can survive it. Can he? Mara said. A silence. The horses walked. Not with the Colorado letter, Eliza said. That's not a charge anyone survives intact. The Greer situation Bragg's manufactured case against me. Those are territorial matters that might get messy and complicated. But Samuel Oates dying on Roe's instruction is a federal homicide. Different kind of thing entirely. The plain opened out ahead of them, enormous and white and indifferent to the specific human dramas being carried across its surface. The mountains stood where they always stood. The wind moved the dry grass at the edges of the frozen track. They stopped once, an hour outside of Laramie, to rest the horses and eat the provisions. Colton had thought to pack into the saddlebags that morning dried jerky and hard bread, the kind of food that isn't good but is nourishing, which is what matters when you're cold and have miles still to cover. They stood beside the horses in the gray afternoon and ate without much talk, and Eliza felt the exhaustion of the day settling into her bones with a weight that was different from the exhaustion of the jail cell or the exhaustion of waiting. This was the exhaustion of having moved, of having done things, of having put pieces in motion that could not be taken back. She thought about Fielding Rowe in his warm office, in Blackridge receiving the news of his morning. Crow's report, the telegraph, Bragg backing down from the draw, the woman who was supposed to be sold and gone, still present and apparently in possession of several things that should not exist. She wondered what his face looked like when he got all of that. Couldn't quite picture it. She had never seen his face. What does he look like? She asked Colton. Rowe. Colton thought about it. Ordinary, he said. That's what Kern said. Completely ordinary-looking man. Medium height. Brown hair going gray. The kind of face you forget immediately. He paused. Kern said that's what made him dangerous. That he looked like someone who ran a dry goods store. Ordinary face. 20 years of using that ordinary face to ruin people and take their land and silence the ones who knew too much. She thought about Samuel Oates, the rancher in Colorado, who had refused to sell and ended up in a creek. She thought about what that family had lived with for 7 years, not knowing, only suspecting. The Colorado charge holds, she said. Oates's family should know. They will, Colton said. Kern was in contact with them. He never gave up on that case. He looked at her. One thing at a time, I know. She ate the last of the jerky and folded the cloth it had been wrapped in. I know. They mounted again and rode the last hour into Laramie as the sun dropped behind the mountains and the temperature fell another sharp degree. The town came up in the dimming light larger than Blackridge, more settled, with stone buildings on the main street and gas lamps already burning in the dusk. Eliza had been to Laramie twice before. It had never felt particularly welcoming. Tonight it felt like the most welcome sight she had seen in months. Aldous Kern lived on a side street off the main avenue in a house that was well maintained in the specific way of a man who had nothing else to do with his attention. He was perhaps 70, white-haired, with the particular upright posture of a former lawman, who had carried himself that way for so long it had become structural rather than deliberate, opened the door before they knocked, which suggested he had been watching the street. Vale, he said. Then he looked at Eliza, then at Mara. Something in his eyes went very still and very alert. You found the Whitlock woman. She found herself, Colton said. Can we come in? They went in. The house was warm, a real fire, books on every wall, the home of a man who read things and thought about them, and had arranged his retirement around continuing to do both. Kern poured coffee without asking, and they sat at a heavy table in the front room. Colton laid the signed statement and the Colorado letter on the table, and Kern put his reading glasses on and read them slowly and completely without saying anything. When he finished, he sat for a moment with his hands flat on the table. 7 years, he said. Not to any of them, to himself, or to the room, or to the particular quality of justice that takes 7 years and a dead man's hearthstone to finally come into the light. The telegraph went to Pruitt's court this morning, Colton said. They'll have it by now. Kern nodded slowly. I can be in Cheyenne in 2 days, he said. I know Pruitt's clerk personally, and I have 12 years of documentation on Rowe's activities that I've been keeping current even after I retired because he stopped, looked at the letter again, because I knew it wasn't finished. Eliza sat at Aldous Kern's table in the warm house in Laramie and felt something move through her that was not quite the thing she had imagined feeling when she tried to imagine this moment. She had imagined relief, maybe, or satisfaction, or the clean resolution of something that had been unresolved for too long. What she actually felt was more complicated than any of those things. It was something like standing at the edge of a thing you've been moving toward for so long that arriving is its own kind of disorientation. The motion had been the constant. The arriving was strange. She thought, Mara is safe. The documents exist. Pruitt's court knows. Kern is here, she thought. It is not finished. It may not go the way it should. Roe has money and time, and a lawyer in Abilene who makes problems disappear. The world does not always correct itself cleanly, but the record existed now. Her name was in it, and Mara's name, and Samuel Oates's name, and the name of a dead rancher's family in Colorado who deserved to know that someone had finally gotten close enough to the truth to put it in writing. That mattered. Whatever came next, and she knew that what came next would not be simple, that mattered, and could not be unmattered. She wrapped her hands around the coffee cup and felt the heat of it through her palms and thought, I am not in a jail cell. I am not on a platform. I am at a table with people who know what I know and have the means to do something with it. That was not the ending. But it was not something that looked very much like the beginning of one. Judge Harlan Pruitt's inquiry opened in Cheyenne 17 days after Eliza Hollowell walked into Aldous Kern's house in Laramie with cold hands and a tin of documents pressed against her ribs. 17 days was not a long time in the ordinary operation of territorial law. It was a very short time when one of the subjects of the inquiry had money and a lawyer in Abilene and a documented habit of making inconvenient things dissolve. That it happened in 17 days was a function of several things. Kern's 12 years of accumulated documentation, Colton's former standing in the Marshal's service, and the particular temper of Harlan Pruitt, who was, as advertised, a man who did not enjoy being preceded by someone else's interference in his court's business. Fielding Roe arrived in Cheyenne with his lawyer and a composed expression and the confidence of a man who had survived 8 years of Aldous Kern's attention and emerged intact. He sat at the respondent's table and answered questions with a careful precision of someone who had rehearsed the line between an admission and denial until it was as smooth as Riverstone. He held that line for 4 days. On the 5th day, Mara Whitlock gave her testimony. She sat in the witness chair in the federal courtroom, and she was small and fair, and visibly frightened, and she told the truth anyway. All of it. The night in Greer's house. What had happened. What Roe had come to her room and said the week after. The specific words he had used about her husband's death in the Kansas jail. Words that had been intended to make her understand the shape of the threat without ever technically constituting one. She said all of it in a clear, steady voice that only broke once, on the sentence about her husband, and then steadied itself again. Eliza sat in the gallery and watched and did not look away. She owed Mara that. The witness chair was the loneliest place in any room, and you bore it better. Knowing someone's eyes were on you with something other than judgment. Roe's lawyer objected several times. Pruitt overruled him each time with the brisk efficiency of a man who had already read the documents and understood what they meant and was not in the mood for theater. Colorado letter was entered into evidence on the 6th day. Kern testified to its provenance and to his 12 years of documentation regarding Roe's methods in history. Darius Crow, who had quietly and professionally withdrawn from his engagement with Roe within 24 hours of the conversation in the Black Ridge Alley, submitted a written statement confirming that the Kansas warrant had been commissioned through Yarwick's office in Abilene, and that he had been given deliberately incomplete information about its origins. Crow was not a good man either, but he was a pragmatic one, and pragmatic men make useful witnesses when the alternative is federal liability. Eliza did not like him, and she did not need to. The statement was what mattered. On the 8th day, Fielding Roe's lawyer requested a recess and spent 2 hours in a private room with the lawyer, and then came back and entered a formal acknowledgement of responsibility on 3 counts in exchange for a sentencing arrangement that kept Roe out of a federal penitentiary but stripped him of his property holdings, his business licenses, and his liberty to operate in Wyoming and Colorado territories for the remainder of his natural life. It was not hanging. Eliza had not expected hanging. The world rarely resolved itself into that kind of clean finality, and she had made her peace with that somewhere on the long ride between Black Ridge and Laramie, sitting on a nameless dun horse in the January cold. What she had expected and what she received was this formal written finding from Judge Pruitt's court that the charges against Eliza Vane Hollowell, the Blackridge theft charge, and the fraudulent Kansas warrant both were declared void, originating in fabricated evidence and unlawful procedure, and that her record was to be corrected accordingly in all territorial documents where her name appeared in connection with those charges. Pruitt's clerk handed her the paper in the hallway outside the courtroom. It was a single page. Her name was on it. The court seal was on it. Said, in the careful language of official documents, that she had done nothing wrong. She stood in the hallway and held it and read it twice. Then she folded it and put it in her coat pocket and stood there for a moment longer than was strictly necessary, because she had spent 3 months imagining this moment, and now that it was here, she found she needed a moment to simply occupy it before moving on. Colton was waiting at the end of the hallway. He had been in the courtroom for the testimony, but had come out before the clerk found her, and he was standing with his back against the wall and his hat in his hands, doing nothing, just waiting, the way he did everything without performance, without impatience. She walked to him and held up the paper. He read it. His jaw moved slightly. He handed it back. "There it is," he said. "There it is," she agreed. They stood in the hallway in the federal courthouse in Cheyenne, and neither of them said anything else for a moment, because sometimes a moment needs to be what it is without anyone narrating it. Hector Bragg lost his deputy's position. Within 2 weeks of the inquiry's conclusion, the sheriff of Blackridge, having decided very rapidly that distance from the entire situation was his best available option. Bragg did not face criminal charges. The case against him was procedurally messy enough that Pruitt's court declined to pursue it, but he was done in Blackridge, and he knew it. Eliza heard he had gone south. She did not think about him often. The sheriff himself resigned before he was asked to. That was, she supposed, a kind of justice, the kind that doesn't make the record books, but happens anyway. Mara Whitlock did not return to Blackridge. She went east on the stagecoach out of Cheyenne. With a small amount of money that Kern had arranged from a territorial victims fund that most people didn't know existed, and a letter of reference from Pruitt's clerk for employment. And she was going to Kansas, not the Kansas of the forged warrant, but the real Kansas, where she had a sister she hadn't seen in 4 years. She and Eliza said goodbye in Smart Room corridor on the last day of the inquiry. It was brief. Neither of them were women who had been given the conditions under which elaborate goodbyes came naturally. "Thank you," Mara said. "You did the hard part," Eliza said, and she meant it. Walking into that witness chair had been Mara's act, not hers. The tin under the hearthstone and the telegraph to Cheyenne, those were pieces. The testimony was the thing that held them together. Mara looked at her for a moment with those sleepless eyes, which had, over the 17 days, begun to look fractionally less sleepless. "I hope it was worth it," she said. "For you. I hope whatever comes next is worth what it cost." Eliza thought about the platform in Blackridge and the dollar on the frozen step and the 6 days in a cell that smelled of iron and old tobacco. She thought about August, the mule in his warm stall, and a cracked hoof wall, and the east-facing window in the back room of a small house at the end of a rutted track. "Yes," she said, "I think it will be." She and Colton rode back to the ranch in the first week of February. The weather had turned slightly, the way Wyoming weather sometimes turns in early February, not warm, nothing so dramatic as warm, but less brutal. The sky was a deeper blue, and the light had a different quality to it, the particular quality of light that carries the very distant suggestion of something coming back to life even when nothing has yet moved. The ranch looked the same as she had left it. The porch roof still sagged on the left. The shutter still hung at its angle. The barn was in better shape than the house, which still told her the same thing about the man who owned both. August was standing in his stall with his expression of bottomless skepticism, which did not change when she came in. She put her hand on his neck, and he tolerated it in the way he tolerated most things, not warmly, but not coldly either. Just yes. See, you exist. I am aware of it. Hello, August, she said. August breathed out through his nose. She stood in the barn for a while, just standing, feeling the particular quality of a familiar place after an absence. It was strange to have a place feel familiar. She had not had that in a long time, not since she was 14, and her uncle had sold the Ohio farm, and she had stepped off into the rest of her life with nothing but what she could carry, and the skills she'd accumulated in those 14 years of watching careful, practical people manage the world. She thought about what Mara had said. Whatever comes next. There was a thing about surviving something like what she had survived, and she had understood this in an abstract way before, but now understood it in the specific physical way that only experience teaches, which is that surviving is not the end of anything. It's more like a doorway. You come through it, and the question waiting on the other side is not whether you made it, but what you're going to do with the having made it. She was 26 years old. She had $11 to her name, which Kern had given her from the same territorial fund that had helped Mara, and a coat that needed replacing before next winter, and a piece of paper in her pocket that said she was who she had always said she was. She had a ranch around her that needed a fence section replaced on the east side. She had noticed on the ride-in, and cattle that needed looking at, and a mule that had decided she was acceptable company, even if he wasn't going to make a production of it. She thought, this is not nothing. She thought, people spend their whole lives waiting for someone to tell them they're worth something, waiting for a room to go quiet and a face to turn toward them with genuine recognition. And the hard truth, the truth she had earned the right to carry, was that it couldn't come from outside you. It could be confirmed from outside. A man could set $1 on a frozen step and say you're not something to be sold and mean every word of it. A judge could put a seal on a piece of paper and correct the record. Those things mattered. She wasn't going to pretend they didn't. But they were confirmation of something that had to already be there. Something you had to have decided about yourself before anyone else could recognize it. Eliza had almost let 3 months in a jail cell and 6 days on a platform convince her that the world's opinion of her value was the true one, and she had not. She had held on to the knowledge of what she actually knew, what she had actually seen, what had actually happened in that house, and that holding on, that stubborn insistence on the truth of her own experience, was what had made everything else possible. That was the thing worth knowing. Not the ending, which was messy and partial, and left Roe alive and Bragg unpunished, and a rancher named Samuel Oates, still dead 7 years in the Colorado ground. The thing worth knowing was the holding on. Colton came into the barn while she was still standing there. He had put the horses up and was checking on Clara, who was in fine shape and had missed nobody in particular, being a horse with her own priorities. He moved around the stalls with that quiet efficiency she had come to know as simply the way he was in spaces, where animals were present, careful, undemonstrative, competent. East fence, she said. I saw it, he said. I can fix it tomorrow if the weather holds. He looked at her across Clara's back. Something in his expression was doing something she had seen building over 17 days in Cheyenne in the hallways and the waiting rooms and the long evenings in the lodging house, where they had sat at separate tables in the common room and sometimes talked and sometimes didn't. And in both cases it was not uncomfortable, which was its own kind of information. Eliza, he said. She waited. You don't have to stay, he said. The paper is in your pocket. You're free to go wherever you could go anywhere. Kern mentioned there's work in Laramie for someone who knows land records. Given the amount of Roe's holdings that'll be in probate, you'd be good at it. She looked at him. Is that what you want? For me to go to Laramie? He was quiet. The way he was quiet when he was not editing himself, but actually working out what was true. No, he said. That's not what I want. Then say what you want, she said. Not harsh. Just say it plainly, because I am too tired for anything else, and because you have been honest with me about everything else. And this should not be different. He set his hands on the top of the stall gate and looked at her. I want you to stay, he said. Not because the fence needs fixing, or Clara needs looking at, or because I need someone to name the animals. Because he stopped. Started again. Because this place is better with you in it. And I think I am better with you in it. Which is not something I expected to be able to say about anyone again. He paused. That's what I want. If you want something different, I understand that. You asked. She looked at him, standing in the barn he kept better than his house, in the coat that had seen too many winters, with his split knuckles, and his unnamed animals, and his sister named Eleanor, who he still missed loudly enough that you could hear it in the silence around her name. He was not a simple man. He was not an easy man. He had a door he kept closed, and a history that had made him into someone who lived alone on purpose and didn't care much about the things you eat alone in. He was going to be difficult in ways she couldn't yet predict, and she was going to be difficult in ways he couldn't yet predict, and neither of them was going to be easy for the other. She had known that from the first night at the table with the beans and the salt pork. She had filed it and kept it, and found that it did not change anything that mattered. The shutter on the front window needs the hinge replaced, she said. He blinked. Yes, and the porch roof. The left side, he said. I know, we fix those first, she said, before the spring work starts. The house should be in as good a shape as the barn. Quiet for a moment. Then something happened in his face that was not quite a smile, but was in the same territory. Something that broke through the usual stillness and showed the man underneath it, the one who had missed the noise of a sister, who talked enough for two, and who had set $1 on a frozen step. Because he couldn't undo the past, but could do something about the present. All right, he said. August the mule made a sound from his stall. It was not an enthusiastic sound, but it was present, which from August was the equivalent. Eliza Hollowell stayed. She fixed the east fence the next day, and the porch roof the day after, and the shutter hinge the day after that, and the house began, slowly and imperfectly, to look like a place where someone had decided that the inside of a room was worth caring about. It was not a transformation. Nothing about it was dramatic. It was just the accumulation of small decisions made by two people who had both spent too long living as if permanence was something that happened to other people. She was not the woman they had laughed at on the platform. She was also not some corrected, improved version of herself. She was the same woman who had stood there in the January, cold with her jaw tight and her eyes fixed on the mountains and her hands curled at her sides. What was different was not the woman. What was different was that the woman had stopped waiting for the world's permission to take up space. The snow melted late that year, and the spring came in slowly, and the ranch work expanded with the season, and the cattle were 12 again, after a difficult birth in March, that Eliza managed in the barn at 2 in the morning with cold hands and the particular focused calm that comes from having done something hard before and knowing it's possible. Colton held the lantern and passed her what she asked for without comment, and when it was done and the calf was up and nursing and everything was going to be fine, he looked at her, across the animal's back in the lantern light, with an expression she recognized by then. It was the same expression she had seen on the platform in Black Ridge. Not pity, not performance. Just I see you. Actually see you. Not despite anything and not in spite of anything. Just you as you are, which is enough. The calf, when she named it, and she named all the animals now, a practice Colton had stopped objecting to around, the third week of February, she called January, because that was where it started. The month that had taken everything from her and then, by the strange and improbable arithmetic of the world, given it all back with interest. She was not too much. She had never been too much. She had simply been waiting, in the way that things wait when they know their own weight and are patient enough to let the rest of the world catch up to it. She was still waiting for nothing.